Before you close your eyes tonight, consider one question that historians have argued over for more than 80 years. What does it take for a man to climb to the very top of the most powerful military machine the modern world had ever seen? Not through genius, not through nobility, not through the admiration of his peers, but through fear, fanaticism, and a willingness to do what no one else would dare. That question has one answer, and the answer is a name: Ferdinand Schörner. He was not a Prussian aristocrat. He did not attend the finest academies or inherit a family lineage of generals. He was born the son of a Bavarian police officer in the old city of Munich in the summer of 1892, a city of beer halls and church bells, of conservative order and quiet pride. No one who watched the boy grow up in those cobblestone streets would have imagined that he would one day hold in his hands the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, command more territory than most nations possessed, and be named in the last written words of Adolf Hitler himself as the final commander of the German army. Yet, that is exactly what happened. And the story of how it happened, the choices he made, the men he destroyed, the loyalty he sold himself into, and the disgrace that ultimately consumed him, is one of the strangest, most disturbing, and most revealing chapters in the entire history of the Second World War. This is not a story about heroism in the conventional sense. It is a story about a system, a machine of ideology and iron discipline, and the kind of man that machine created. It is a story about what happens when ambition has no moral flaw. It is, above everything else, a story about power, who holds it, who craves it, what it costs, and what it destroys on its way out. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, let this story carry you through the night, because this documentary will not rush. We will walk with Ferdinand Schörner from the very beginning, from those Munich streets, through the mud of the First World War, through the fractured chaos of the Weimar years, through the thundering machinery of the Second World War's Eastern Front, to the last act of a man who gave everything to a cause that was already dying, and then, when it mattered most, ran. If you enjoy long-form, deeply researched historical documentaries like this one, consider subscribing. Every week we bring you stories from the most extraordinary chapters in human history, told slowly, told fully, and told with the respect they deserve. Tonight, we begin the complete history of Ferdinand Schörner. Chapter 1. The Boy from Munich. Munich, in the final decade of the 19th century, was a city caught between two worlds. It was still recognizably the old Bavarian capital, Catholic, conservative, deeply rooted in tradition, but it was also beginning to feel the electrical charge of a modernizing Germany, an empire newly forged, and still learning the weight of its own ambitions. Into this city, on the 12th of June 1892, a boy was born into the household of a senior police officer. His name was Ferdinand Schörner. He was the second child, and from his earliest years, the household in which he grew was one structured around obedience, rank, and the understanding that authority was not questioned, it was served. His father's profession matters more than it might first appear. A police officer in the German Empire of the 1890s occupied a particular cultural space. He was not a soldier, but he was adjacent to soldiering. He enforced order, wore a uniform, and derived his authority from the state. The values Ferdinand absorbed as a child, punctuality, hierarchy, the belief that discipline separated civilized men from chaos, were not taught abstractly. They were lived, daily, in the rhythms of his home. These values would follow him for the rest of his life. They would be the things he admired most in others, and the things he enforced most savagely when he believed others lacked them. As a young man, Schörner showed enough academic ability to pursue university study. He enrolled with the intention of becoming a teacher, a profession that requires, in its own quiet way, a certain comfort with authority and the management of subordinates. He studied geography and economics, subjects that would later give him an instinct for terrain and logistics that served him surprisingly well in the field. But the classroom, it turned out, was not where Ferdinand Schörner would make his mark on the world. Something older and louder was calling him. In the late summer of 1911, at the age of 19, he joined the Bavarian army as a one-year volunteer with the Bavarian Lieb Regiment, the regiment traditionally assigned as personal guards to the Bavarian royal family itself. The Lieb Regiment was not just any unit. It carried with it centuries of tradition, of iron discipline, of the peculiar Bavarian pride that stood slightly apart from the Prussian military establishment that dominated the rest of the German army. By enlisting here, Schörner was not simply joining the military, he was joining a lineage, a brotherhood, a way of thinking about service and duty that was older than the German Empire itself. He adapted to it almost immediately. The records of his early service show a young man who not only met the standard, but pressed against it, who found in military structure not a cage but a comfort, who felt, perhaps for the first time, fully at home. By the summer of 1912, he had been promoted to the rank of a non-commissioned officer. By the following year, he had climbed again. These are not remarkable promotions, they are the ordinary progressions of a capable and obedient young soldier, but they tell a consistent story. Schörner was not brilliant in the way that, say, Erich von Manstein was brilliant, with sweeping operational intuition and the ability to see entire campaigns in his mind. What Schörner had was different, a grinding, relentless competence, an absolutely iron will, and a tolerance for hardship that would outlast almost everyone around him. These qualities do not always make great commanders, but they make survivors. The world that made him was already carrying the seeds of catastrophe. The Europe of 1911, 1912, 1913, the years of Schörner's early military service, was a continent of accumulating pressures, of alliances coiling tighter, of empires beginning to sense their own fragility even as they performed confidence for one another. The young Bavarian soldier drilling on his regiment's parade grounds had no way of knowing that within 3 years the entire continent would be at war in a way no living person had ever seen. He had no way of knowing that war would become the furnace in which his character was finally, permanently set. He was simply a soldier, doing what soldiers do, waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for the event that would define his generation. That event came in the summer of 1914, and when it came, Ferdinand Schörner was ready for it, in ways that even he probably did not yet fully understand. The war that was about to begin would last 4 years, claim the lives of millions, redraw the map of Europe, and produce, in the bodies and minds of those who survived it, a generation of men shaped by experiences so extreme that ordinary civilian life would never quite feel real again. For Schörner, the First World War was not merely a crucible, it was a revelation. It showed him what he was made of. And in the darkest corners of what the war revealed, the seeds of everything that would follow, the ruthlessness, the fanaticism, the absolute inability to accept defeat, were quietly taking root. Before we leave the quiet streets of his childhood, it is worth pausing for a moment to consider what Munich itself represented to the generation of Germans who grew up there in the decades around the turn of the century. It was a city of deep cultural pride, home to artists and philosophers, to breweries and Baroque churches, to a tradition of intellectual life that sat uneasily alongside the rigid conservatism of its political culture. It was also a city that would, within Schörner's own lifetime, become the birthplace of the movement that would ultimately consume his career and define his legacy. The coincidence, if it can even be called that, between Schörner's birthplace and the geographical origins of Nazism is one of the more quietly significant details in his story. He and the movement that would elevate him grew up in the same soil. They breathed the same air. What the boy from Munich became was not inevitable. No life is. At every stage of his development, there were choices, small ones, mostly, but choices nonetheless, that directed him down the particular path he took, rather than the many other paths he might have taken. He chose the army over the classroom. He chose discipline over creativity. He chose service over independence. And later he would make other choices, political choices, moral choices, that were far less innocent than these early ones. But for now, as we close the first chapter of his life, he is simply a young Bavarian soldier, newly uniformed, newly sworn, beginning to learn the trade that would occupy him for the rest of his active years. The city he was born in glitters in the summer light behind him. The future, as yet, holds no shadows. Underscore. Chapter 2. Fire and Ice. The First World War. Underscore. The First World War announced itself in the summer of 1914, like a door being kicked open. In the weeks following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the alliance systems of Europe activated one by one, pulling nation after nation into a conflict that had been structurally inevitable for years, and yet still managed to arrive with the force of a genuine surprise. Germany mobilized with extraordinary speed. The Schlieffen Plan, the great strategic blueprint for a two-front war, was set in motion. Regiments across Bavaria, Prussia, Saxony, and the rest of the empire assembled and began their march toward a conflict that their commanding officers confidently expected would be over before Christmas. It would not be over before Christmas. It would not be over for 4¼ years, and it would be nothing like what anyone had imagined. For Ferdinand Schörner, the war began in August of 1914. He was 22 years old, a junior soldier in the Bavarian army, fit and trained, and ideologically primed for the experience of combat that his entire upbringing had pointed him toward. His regiment was among the units that moved into action in the opening weeks of the war on the Western Front, fighting through the forests and river valleys of Lorraine, taking part in the kind of fluid, aggressive movement that the German High Command had planned for, before the front hardened into the grinding immobility of trench warfare. He saw action in the battles around the Saar region, in country where men advanced in lines under rifle fire, where officers led from the front, and where the gap between bravery and death was measured in seconds. By November of that first year, Schörner had been promoted to the rank of reserve lieutenant. This was meaningful recognition. He had performed well enough under fire, early enough in the war's chaos, to be elevated from the enlisted ranks into the officer corps. The promotion confirmed what his earlier service had suggested, that Schörner was not a man who flinched. He was, if anything, the opposite, someone who moved toward danger rather than away from it, who found in extreme pressure not paralysis but clarity. This quality, the ability to function, even excel, in conditions that destroyed others, would define his military reputation for the next 30 years. The Western Front settled into its infamous static form through the winter of 1914 and into 1915. Miles of trenches, barbed wire, and no man's land replaced the open advances of the opening campaign. But the war's geography was not static everywhere. Schörner's path through the conflict would eventually take him far from the mud of France and Belgium to terrain that suited his particular talents, to mountain country, to the high ridges and narrow passes of the Italian front, to a theatre of the war that demanded not just courage, but physical endurance, and a willingness to fight in conditions that would have stopped most soldiers entirely. He would find his defining moment there. The Italian front was, in many respects, the forgotten theatre of the First World War. While the battles of the Somme and Verdun consumed millions of men and dominated the imagination of the century that followed, the fighting along the Isonzo River, between Austro-Hungarian and Italian forces, with growing German involvement, was its own sustained catastrophe. The terrain was extraordinary, the Isonzo Valley carved through limestone mountains, the ridges rising steeply above the river, the paths narrow and treacherous, the weather in winter capable of killing soldiers without a single enemy bullet being fired. It was here, in the autumn of 1917, that the battle that would make Ferdinand Schörner's reputation was fought. The Battle of Caporetto, known in Italian history as the Great Disaster, known in German and Austro-Hungarian memory as a masterpiece of combined arms assault. The 14th German Army struck the Italian lines near the Isonzo River in late October of 1917, with a force and speed that overwhelmed the defending troops. Schörner was part of this assault, leading his mountain unit through terrain that most military planners would have considered impassable. On the Collovrat Ridge, a series of high, exposed positions that formed a critical part of the Italian defensive line, Schörner and his men attacked. The objective was Hill 114, a fortified position commanding views in every direction, a position that had to be taken if the breakthrough was to hold. Schörner led from the front. The position fell. His conduct in this engagement earned him the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor for bravery in the field, the medal known colloquially as the Blue Max for the blue enamel of its Maltese cross design. The decoration was presented to him on the 5th of December 1917. It placed him in an extraordinary company. The Blue Max was rare. It was awarded not for longevity or rank, but for exceptional personal courage under fire, and the manner of its award to Schörner carried a footnote that would follow him for years. Among the others, decorated at Caporetto, was a fellow German officer named Erwin Rommel, later, of course, the Desert Fox. Rommel officially protested that Schörner's award duplicated an action Rommel believed was primarily his own. The two men's careers would run on parallel tracks for decades, and they would come to represent, in the eyes of history, almost perfect opposites. One, a symbol of chivalrous professionalism, the other, of ideological ruthlessness. At Caporetto, their paths crossed for the first and most intimate time, in a dispute over a shared ridge on a mountain neither of them would ever return to. Schörner emerged from the First World War, with his character irreversibly formed. He had been decorated with his nation's highest honor. He had been tested in the most extreme conditions that early 20th century warfare could produce: mountain combat, assault operations, prolonged exposure to cold and deprivation. And he had not broken. By the time Germany surrendered in November of 1918, Schörner had reached the rank of first lieutenant. He was 26 years old and had spent 4 of those years at war. He had seen enough death to either soften a man or harden him permanently. In Schörner's case, there was no softening. The iron that the war put into him would stay there for the rest of his life. What no one could have predicted in the silence after the armistice was where that iron would eventually take him, and what it would be used for. The Germany that Schörner returned to was unrecognizable. The Kaiser had abdicated. The empire was gone, a republic, democratic, fragile, and immediately despised by vast numbers of the men who had fought to protect the nation it replaced, was struggling to assert itself against currents of rage and resentment that would prove, ultimately, too strong to hold. For a man like Schörner, formed entirely by military structure, committed entirely to hierarchy and obedience, and the absolute rightness of German national will, the Weimar Republic was not a solution. It was an insult. The coming years would show how that insult settled into something permanent, and how the choices Schörner made in response to it would set the course for everything that followed. Chapter 3. The Years Between. Weimar, the Freikorps, and the Rising Shadow, Germany, after the First World War, was a nation that had lost its story. The empire that had given millions of men their sense of purpose, their identity, their reason for sacrifice, was gone. What remained was a republic that had been born in defeat, signed an armistice that the right wing immediately branded a betrayal, and faced, simultaneously, a grinding economic crisis, political extremism from both its left and right flanks, and the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty's terms. For professional soldiers like Ferdinand Schörner, this was not merely a difficult period, it was a philosophical crisis. They had given everything to an institution, the German army, that had been limited, reduced, and in many cases stripped of its purpose by international agreement. The Versailles Treaty capped Germany's army at 100,000 men. For the tens of thousands of officers who had built their entire lives around military service, this was not a policy, it was an erasure. Schörner chose to remain in the army, now reorganized as the Reichswehr, the armed force of the new republic. This was not a simple choice. Many officers left, some bitter, some disillusioned, some simply unable to adapt to the new reduced scale of the institution they had served. Those who stayed tended to be the ones who were most committed to the profession itself, regardless of the political framework surrounding it. Schörner stayed. He adapted. He found his place in the smaller, tighter, more carefully selective organization the Reichswehr became, and he continued to be promoted, slowly, within the narrow limits that the treaty allowed, because he continued to be what he had always been, capable, demanding, and absolutely relentless. But staying in the army did not mean keeping clear of politics. In the volatile, fractured Germany of the 1920s, almost no one kept entirely clear of politics, certainly not soldiers, who were embedded in the very center of the question that dominated the decade: what kind of state was Germany, and what kind of state should it become? Schörner's political leanings were right-wing from the beginning, shaped by his conservative Bavarian Catholic background and hardened by his experience of the war and its aftermath. He was not yet a Nazi. The party was still in its infancy during these years. But he was, like many Bavarian officers, deeply sympathetic to the nationalist and anti-republican currents that the Nazi Party was seeking to channel. His relationship with the nascent Nazi movement was, in the early 1920s, one of proximity rather than commitment. In 1923, he served as adjutant to General Otto von Lossow, the commander of the Bavarian military district. When Hitler and his supporters launched the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich in November of that year, an attempt to seize power by force, beginning in a Munich beer hall and intended to cascade into a national revolution, Schörner was, through Lossow, on the side that suppressed it. The putsch failed. Hitler was arrested, tried and sentenced to prison, where he would dictate Mein Kampf and emerge more dangerous than before. Schörner, who had been present on the other side of the barricades, was apparently untouched by the irony of what his future would hold, because within a few years of the putsch, Schörner had crossed the political line. He joined the Nazi Party. The exact timing of this is placed by various sources in the mid-1920s. He was among those who signed on early, before the party had achieved national power, before it was safe or inevitable to do so. This was not opportunism, not in the ordinary sense. He could not have known, in 1925 or 1926, that the party he was joining would be governing Germany within less than a decade. His membership reflected genuine ideological alignment, the nationalism, the anti-communism, the contempt for the parliamentary democracy of Weimar, the vision of a restored and powerful German state. These were not positions Schörner held reluctantly. They matched something deep in his character. The Reichswehr of the 1920s and early 30s was officially a non-political institution. Officers were expected to serve the state, not the party. In practice, of course, this was a fiction that grew thinner every year as the Republic weakened and the extremist parties gathered strength. Schörner navigated this tension the way many officers did, maintaining his formal military identity while making his sympathies increasingly clear. He continued to be promoted. He worked as a staff officer and instructor. He taught geography and tactics to younger officers. He built, methodically, the professional credentials that would eventually position him for the high command that lay ahead. But it was the politics, ultimately, that would accelerate his rise beyond anything that purely professional merit could have achieved. The Great Depression arrived in 1929 and delivered the final blow to whatever stability the Weimar Republic had managed to construct. Unemployment swept across Germany in numbers that were almost impossible to comprehend. The political parties that had built the Republic seemed unable, or unwilling, to respond with any coherence. Into that vacuum, with extraordinary political skill, with propaganda that spoke directly to the anger and humiliation of millions, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party drove their campaign for power. By January of 1933, Hitler was Chancellor of Germany. Within months, the Republic was effectively over. For Ferdinand Schörner, this was not disaster, it was deliverance. The state he had spent a decade serving with private contempt was gone. The movement he had privately supported was now the government. The values he had internalized, the absolute authority of a strong leader, the military virtues of discipline and obedience, the national destiny of Germany as a European power, were now official policy. Promotions came faster. In 1934, he was elevated to Major, a rank he had been waiting years for. By 1937, he was a lieutenant colonel commanding the 98th Mountain Regiment. He was 45 years old, a veteran of one world war, a proven survivor of the interwar's treacherous currents, and positioned now at the exact right moment in history to benefit from everything that was coming next. The history of this period, the 1930s, the years of rearmament and resurgence, and the slow drumbeat toward another catastrophe, is often told through the lens of the political leadership, Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, the party apparatus. But it is worth understanding that every decision made in those rooms required, for its execution, tens of thousands of men like Schörner, professional soldiers who had spent the lean years maintaining their craft, who were now handed the resources and the mandate to build the most powerful military force Europe had seen since Napoleon. Schörner threw himself into this project with everything he had. The mountain regiment he commanded became one of the elite units of the growing Wehrmacht. His reputation as a hard, demanding, technically competent officer was exactly what the expanding army needed, and his political reliability, his genuine, unconditional commitment to the regime, made him something else again, not just a soldier, but a true believer. That combination, in the Germany of 1939, was about to become the most valuable currency in the world. Chapter 4. Into the Storm. Poland, the Balkans, and the Mountain Warrior. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. It was not the first act of aggression the Third Reich had committed. The reoccupation of the Rhineland, the absorption of Austria, the seizure of the Sudetenland, the occupation of Czechoslovakia had all preceded it. But it was the act that finally, undeniably, triggered the war. Britain and France declared war on Germany. Europe was, once again, at war. For Ferdinand Schörner, now an Oberst, a full colonel, commanding the 98th Mountain Regiment, this was the moment everything had been building toward. He was 47 years old. He had waited through a depression and a republic, and the slow years of restricted rearmament for this. And he was ready. His regiment's role in the Polish campaign was relatively limited in scope, compared to the armoured and motorised formations that drove the decisive thrusts into Polish territory. Mountain troops, Gebirgsjäger, were specialist units, built for terrain that tanks could not navigate, trained for endurance over speed. But the Polish campaign was, in its core, a campaign of overwhelming speed and coordination, and even the mountain units were swept into the momentum of a military operation that shattered Polish resistance in less than a month. For Schörner, Poland was not a defining campaign. It was a proving ground, a confirmation that his regiment functioned, that the training had held, that the machine he had built was ready for larger tests. Those larger tests came within months. In the spring of 1940, Germany turned west. France, Belgium, the Netherlands. The speed of that campaign stunned the world. But Schörner was not part of the Western campaign in a primary role. His moment came the following year, in the Balkans. In April of 1941, Germany launched its invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece, and Schörner's 6th Mountain Division, which he now commanded, was assigned to one of the most difficult tasks in the entire campaign, breaching the Metaxas Line. The Metaxas Line was Greece's primary defensive fortification along its border with Bulgaria, named for the Greek Prime Minister who had ordered its construction. It was built into the mountains of northeastern Greece, a network of fortified positions, bunkers, and gun emplacements that used the natural terrain as a force multiplier. The Greek soldiers defending it were tough, experienced, and deeply motivated. They had already fought and beaten an Italian invasion the previous autumn. They were not about to yield to the Germans without a serious fight, and Schörner, now a general commanding a division of elite mountain troops, was handed the task of breaking through. The assault on the Metaxas Line in April of 1941 was one of those episodes in the Balkan campaign that is rarely given its full weight in popular histories, overshadowed by the faster, more dramatic advances of the armoured formations further west. But for the men involved, it was a genuine test of everything mountain warfare demanded. Schörner drove his division hard. The assault worked. The line was breached. The Greek forces in the sector were cut off. Within days, the port city of Thessaloniki, the second largest city in Greece, was isolated and surrendered. Schörner's division then drove south through the Greek countryside, participating in the capture of Athens itself. For this, Hitler personally awarded him the Knight's Cross, the second tier of the Iron Cross decoration, an honor that marked him publicly as one of the successful commanders of the campaign. There is something important to understand about the Knight's Cross that goes beyond its military significance. It was, in the Third Reich, a public statement. It was a decoration that Hitler gave personally, in ceremonies that were photographed and reported. To receive it was to be seen, to be brought into the circle of the Führer's personal attention, to become a named face rather than an anonymous general. For Schörner, the award of the Knight's Cross was the beginning of a personal relationship with Hitler that would shape and ultimately ruin his life. He was not yet the favorite. There were better-known generals, more celebrated victories, other men in the spotlight. But the attention had begun. The relationship was forming. From Greece, the war moved north and east. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on the 22nd of June, 1941, and swallowed the entire focus of the German military in a campaign of previously unimaginable scale. Schörner's 6th Mountain Division was assigned to the Arctic sectors of the Eastern Front, operating in Finland alongside Finnish forces against the Soviet positions in the far north. This was a theatre almost entirely unlike the campaigns he had fought so far. The terrain was Arctic tundra and dense boreal forest. The temperatures in winter fell to levels that could kill an unprotected man within hours, and the enemy, despite the scale disadvantages, fought with a stubbornness and tactical competence that confounded German expectations. His task in the far north was to protect the Pechanga nickel works, the mining operations in northern Finland that fed a critical supply of nickel into the German war economy. It was, in strategic terms, a holding operation rather than a decisive thrust. But the conditions it imposed on Schörner and his men were extreme in ways that are hard to convey in ordinary language. The Arctic front was not just cold, though the cold was weapon enough. It was isolated, resupplied with difficulty, far from the centers of command and attention. To lead men effectively in those conditions required a combination of physical toughness, organizational discipline, and sheer will that Schörner, whatever his many faults, genuinely possessed. He was seen at the front. He participated, reportedly, in close quarters fighting on at least one occasion. His men may not have loved him, but they could not say he was absent. By January of 1942, Schörner had been promoted to General Major, the equivalent of a two-star Major General in modern terms. The promotion was recognition of solid, sustained performance in difficult conditions. He was given command of the 19th Mountain Corps, which was part of the German army in Finland. His operational task remained broadly the same: hold the Arctic line, protect the nickel works, prevent the Soviets from breaking through to the Norwegian coast. He did this through 1942 and into 43, grinding, unglamorous work far from the campaigns that were making or breaking reputations further south. But the foundations were being laid, the reputation was being built, and in the south, the war was turning in ways that would soon send opportunity rushing back in his direction. Underscore. Chapter 5. The Eastern Front. Rising Through Catastrophe. Underscore. By the winter of 1942 to 1943, the trajectory of the war had changed. The German advance into the Soviet Union, which had, in its first months, seemed to confirm the strategic vision of its planners, had stalled, been reversed, and been catastrophically broken at Stalingrad. The Sixth Army, encircled and ground down through weeks of winter fighting, surrendered in early February of 1943. More than 90,000 German soldiers walked into Soviet captivity. A German field marshal, Friedrich Paulus, surrendered on enemy soil for the first time in the war. The psychological and strategic impact was enormous. The myth of German military invincibility, already cracked at Moscow the previous winter, was now definitively shattered. Germany was losing the Eastern Front. Not quickly, the Wehrmacht remained a formidable fighting force, capable of local successes and tactical brilliance long after the strategic initiative had passed to the Soviets. But the direction was unmistakable. The vast spaces of the Eastern Front were bleeding the German army in a way that no campaign in the West had done. And as the crisis deepened, the men who rose in the Wehrmacht's hierarchy were increasingly not the thoughtful, professionally cautious generals of the old school. Men like Gerd von Rundstedt or Erich von Manstein, who advised retreat when retreat was warranted, and who understood the limits of what their armies could achieve. The men who rose were the ones who matched Hitler's psychology, who could project absolute conviction, who would stand and fight even in positions that sober analysis suggested were untenable, and who would impose that will on their subordinates by any means necessary. Ferdinand Schörner was exactly that kind of man. In November of 1943, he was given command of the 40th Panzer Corps on the Eastern Front. Not the Arctic holding action, not the specialist mountain warfare, but the central, convulsing, enormously consequential main theatre. He was in his element almost immediately. The Panzer Corps was engaged in the brutal defensive battles of the Dnieper-Carpathian region, where German forces were being pushed steadily westward by Soviet offensives of mounting power and coordination. Schörner's approach to command in these conditions was already what it would remain for the rest of the war. Absolute demands for holding positions, savage punishment for any sign of retreat without orders, and a personal presence at the front that was partly genuine courage and partly performance. A display of iron resolution intended to stiffen the spines of men who had very good reasons to consider their situations hopeless. In early 1944, Schörner was elevated to command of Army Group A, a formation responsible for some of the most contested and critical terrain on the entire Eastern Front. By May of that year, he had been transferred to command Army Group South Ukraine. This was one of the most consequential postings of his career and one of the most revealing. His army group was responsible for the Crimean Peninsula, specifically for the port of Sevastopol, and the 17th German-Romanian Army trapped there. Hitler's standing order was to hold Sevastopol at all costs, as he had ordered the holding of every significant position since the reversal at Stalingrad. The situation in Crimea was, by any objective military analysis, already beyond rescue. Soviet forces had cut off the peninsula, and the trapped German-Romanian forces faced overwhelming pressure. Schörner initially told Hitler what Hitler wanted to hear, that Sevastopol could be held even if the rest of Crimea fell. This was not an honest military assessment. It was the kind of statement that a man makes when he understands that his Führer's emotional investment in a position supersedes any strategic logic. But as the situation deteriorated and the reality became undeniable, Schörner eventually ordered the evacuation. He changed his mind, defied the standing order, and began withdrawing troops. The problem was that he acted too late. The retreat, when it came, was chaotic and incomplete. Many thousands of men, German and Romanian both, were killed or captured on the piers of Sevastopol, waiting for ships that came too few and too late. The evacuation was a partial success at best and a catastrophe at worst. And yet Schörner's career was not damaged. He was promoted. This requires a moment of reflection because it reveals something essential about the command culture of the Wehrmacht in 1944. Schörner's handling of Crimea was, by conventional military standards, deeply flawed, hesitant, dishonest with his superiors, and ultimately responsible for avoidable losses. But in Hitler's judgment, the key criterion was not tactical elegance or the minimization of casualties. It was loyalty and will. Schörner had eventually managed the retreat. He had not wavered into defeatism. He remained, in the Führer's eyes, a man who could be trusted to fight. In May of 1944, he was promoted to the rank of General Oberst, Colonel General, the second highest rank in the Wehrmacht's hierarchy. He was now among the very top tier of German field commanders. The summer of 1944 brought a cascade of disasters for Germany. Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive launched in late June of that year, smashed Army Group Center with a force that dwarfed even the Normandy landings occurring at roughly the same time on the Western Front. Entire German armies were encircled and destroyed. The Eastern Front lurched backward hundreds of kilometers, and in July of 1944, Schörner was given one of the most important and difficult commands of the war, Army Group North, fighting to maintain its positions in the Baltic states as Soviet forces drove south and west, threatening to encircle the entire formation against the Baltic Sea. What followed over the next 6 months, the autumn and winter of 1944, was one of the grimmest chapters in the entire history of the Eastern Front. Army Group North, later renamed Army Group Courland, was progressively isolated. The Soviet Operation Bagration cut the overland connection between the Army Group and the rest of the German forces. More than 200,000 German troops found themselves trapped in the Courland Pocket, a strip of territory on the Latvian coast, pressed between the Baltic Sea and encircling Soviet forces. The soldiers who held that pocket through the following winter did so under conditions of almost unimaginable hardship, launching multiple defensive battles against Soviet forces that outnumbered them many times over. Schörner organized the defense of Courland with genuine operational skill. The pocket held. It was, in the context of 1944 to 1945, an achievement, a demonstration that determined men in prepared positions could resist even overwhelming force for extended periods. He was awarded the Oak Leaves with Swords to his Knight's Cross for this performance, and eventually the Diamonds, the highest grade of the decoration, awarded to only a tiny number of officers in the entire war. His standing with Hitler reached its peak during these months. Goebbels, writing in his diary in the final months of the war, mentioned Schörner repeatedly with explicit praise. "Schörner remains unshakable," Goebbels wrote in one entry. "He is the man we need." What the diary entries from Goebbels do not capture, because Goebbels was not the one living under Schörner's command, was the experience of the ordinary soldiers in Army Group Courland. To serve under Schörner was to live in a state of double fear, the fear of the enemy in front and the fear of the general behind. His disciplinary orders in this period became increasingly severe. Men found away from their positions without written authorization were subject to immediate court-martial. The punishment for desertion was death, and Schörner made sure the death sentences were carried out, visibly, publicly, as a message to every other man in the army group, that the consequences of perceived cowardice would be immediate and final. This was not hidden. Goebbels himself noted it approvingly. It would, in the end, become the primary charge against Schörner when the war crimes trials began. Underscore. Chapter 6. Field Marshal of the Ruins, Army Group Center, and the Last Stand. Underscore. In January of 1945, Ferdinand Schörner was given his final and most consequential command, Army Group Center. By this point, the war was entering its terminal phase. The Vistula-Oder offensive, one of the most powerful Soviet operations of the entire war, had launched in mid-January and driven German forces back across Poland with stunning speed. Red Army forces were approaching the Oder River, the last major natural barrier before Berlin itself. The Third Reich was fighting its final campaign, on its own soil, against an enemy that was now not just militarily superior, but motivated by the full accumulated rage of years of warfare on the Eastern Front. Army Group Center was responsible for defending the Upper Oder and the industrial regions of Silesia, coal mines, factories, the infrastructure of a war economy that was already failing. Hitler issued his customary last stand orders. Silesia would be held. There would be no retreat. Every city was a fortress. Every man would fight. Schörner received these orders and carried them out with an enthusiasm that few other commanders could match. His army group contained some of the last coherent German forces on the Eastern Front, well over 400,000 men in various stages of readiness and depletion. He threw the full weight of his personality into the defense. What that meant, in practice, for the soldiers under his command, was an intensification of the climate of fear that had always characterized his leadership. The standing orders that Schörner had used in Courland, court-martial on the spot for men found behind the front without authorization, were applied with even greater severity in the closing months of the war. As the front disintegrated under Soviet pressure, as units were surrounded and destroyed, and the survivors streamed back in exhaustion and confusion, Schörner's field courts moved through the rear areas, dispensing summary justice. Men were hanged from trees, from lampposts, from whatever structure was available. Around their necks, placards were placed bearing the words that Goebbels had recorded, "I am a deserter. I have declined to defend German women and children, and therefore I have been hanged." These were not enemy soldiers. They were German. Many of them were not deserters in any meaningful sense of the word. They were men who had been cut off from their units by the chaos of collapsing front lines, who were making their way toward friendly forces or waiting for orders that were no longer coming. In one documented episode, a group of soldiers with a disabled half-track, who were waiting for a mechanic to repair their vehicle, were encountered by Schörner's entourage. They were shot for malingering. 22 German soldiers were executed on his direct orders in another recorded incident. Their stated offense was standing around without orders. The war had reduced Ferdinand Schörner to something that his Blue Max from 1917 would never have predicted, a man who was more dangerous to his own troops than to the enemy. On the 5th of April 1945, with Berlin under aerial bombardment and Soviet forces already reaching the Oder, Adolf Hitler promoted Ferdinand Schörner to the rank of Generalfeldmarschall, Field Marshal. He was the last man to receive this promotion in the history of the Wehrmacht. It was, in the context of 1945, an honor as hollow as the empire it came from. The rank of Field Marshal had historically been reserved for Germany's greatest commanders, men who had won campaigns of continental scale, who had reshaped the military map of Europe. Schörner had not won anything. He had held positions that were already lost, enforced discipline in an army that was already broken, and told Hitler what Hitler wanted to hear, while the Reich crumbled around them both. But the promotion was not about military achievement. It was about loyalty. Hitler was, in these final weeks, surrounded by a narrowing circle of men who would tell him the truth, and a much larger circle of men who would tell him what he needed to believe. Schörner belonged firmly and explicitly to the second group. He agreed, in defiance of every competent military judgment available, that the Red Army's primary strategic objective was Prague rather than Berlin, a colossal misreading that led him to maintain heavy forces in Czechoslovakia while the defense of the approaches to Berlin was left dangerously thin. It was, as subsequent historians have noted, both a strategic blunder and a moral one. It reflected a command culture in which truth had become not just dangerous, but structurally impossible. The end, when it came, happened with extraordinary speed. Hitler took his own life in the Berlin bunker on the 30th of April, 1945. In his final testament, he had named Schörner as Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, the successor to himself as the supreme military authority in what remained of the Reich. It was the ultimate expression of everything the relationship between the two men had been, a reward for absolute loyalty, issued by a man with nothing left to give, to a man whose position was now entirely without meaning. Admiral Karl Dönitz, named as Hitler's political successor, was now the head of what remained of the German government. On the 8th of May, the unconditional surrender was signed. The war in Europe was over. Schörner's response to the surrender was revealing in a way that all the years of hard-edged loyalty had not quite been. He ordered his troops to observe the ceasefire. He sent the necessary instructions down the chain of command. And then, rather than stand with the men he had commanded, rather than face capture alongside the soldiers he had hanged and threatened and driven through the final months of a hopeless war, he changed into civilian clothes, boarded an aircraft, and flew to Austria. He landed among American-occupied forces, apparently hoping to negotiate some form of separate arrangement, some path to safety that would shield him from Soviet justice. He was arrested by American troops on the 18th of May 1945, 10 days after the surrender, in the mountain country of Austria, dressed not in a field marshal's uniform, but in the clothes of a civilian. The man who had ordered German soldiers hanged for desertion had, in the end, deserted his own army. The man who had placed placards around the necks of men accused of cowardice had, in his final act as a commander, shown a spectacular form of it. Not the understandable cowardice of exhaustion and despair, but the cold, calculated cowardice of a man protecting himself at the expense of every principle he had publicly claimed to hold. The soldiers of Army Group Center, many of whom fought on for 3 more days after the official German surrender on orders from Schörner's own headquarters, were still dying in Czechoslovakia while their field marshal was being arrested in a meadow in Austria in civilian dress. The trial would come. The accounting would come. The years in Soviet and then German prisons would come. But before we follow Ferdinand Schörner into the courtrooms and the cells, before we examine what justice, imperfect and delayed, eventually looked like, it is worth sitting for a moment in the silence of that Austrian meadow. Here was a man who had started with a genuine talent, who had earned a genuine decoration for genuine bravery, who had possessed real organizational skill and real physical toughness, and all of it, every medal, every promotion, every tactical success, every hard-won kilometer of defensive line, had been placed in the service of something that required, ultimately, the abandonment of everything that makes a soldier worth following. Not just the war, but the man himself had ended in desertion. Chapter 7, The Prisoner. Capture, handover, and the Soviet machine. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a man when the thing he has served his entire life finally collapses beneath him. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest, but the silence of a world that has stopped making sense. Ferdinand Schörner sat in American custody in the mountains of Austria in the 3rd week of May 1945, wearing civilian clothes, and that silence must have been deafening. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. The Third Reich, the state to which he had given his fanaticism, his loyalty, his absolute obedience, and the last 20 years of his military life, existed now only as rubble and paperwork, and the evidence files being assembled by Allied legal teams across the continent. He was 52 years old. He had nowhere left to go. The Americans who arrested him were, by most accounts, not immediately certain of who he was. The removal of the field marshal's uniform was not merely a practical precaution. It was an act of erasure, an attempt to become someone other than the last commander-in-chief of the German army, the man named in Hitler's final testament, the general whose disciplinary orders were already being discussed in Allied intelligence briefings as potential war crimes material. He had calculated, apparently, that the Americans would be more accommodating captors than the Soviets. that the ideological distance between the Western Allies and the Third Reich might create some room for negotiation that the Eastern Front's history would never permit. It was a reasonable calculation, in one sense. It was also, ultimately, futile. The American forces in Austria in May of 1945 were processing extraordinary numbers of German prisoners, hundreds of thousands of soldiers surrendering in the chaos of the final weeks. Officers of every rank, party members, functionaries, soldiers who had committed war crimes, and soldiers who had simply fought for their country and lost. The apparatus for sorting through all of this, for identifying who mattered legally, politically, and strategically, was still being assembled. Schörner moved through the early stages of this apparatus with less immediate consequence than he had feared. He was detained, questioned, documented. But the Americans had other priorities in the weeks immediately after the surrender. The question of what to do with Ferdinand Schörner would take longer to resolve than he might have expected. The answer, when it came, was not what he had hoped for. Under the agreements reached at the wartime Allied conferences, at Tehran, at Yalta, at the subsequent negotiations over the division of the post-war world, German war criminals were to be tried, and the most significant were to be transferred to the relevant Allied power that had the strongest claim to jurisdiction. For Schörner, the relevant power was the Soviet Union. His crimes, the executions, the hangings, the summary courts-martial on the Eastern Front, had occurred on Soviet territory, against Soviet forces, in a theatre of war where the Soviet Union had paid the most catastrophic price in human lives of any nation in the conflict. The Soviets wanted him. The Americans, after deliberation and under the terms of Allied agreements, handed him over. The transfer to Soviet custody occurred in 1945, and from that moment, Ferdinand Schörner entered a world that operated by entirely different rules from the one he had known. Soviet military justice in the post-war period was not primarily interested in establishing due process or allowing extended legal argument. It was interested in accountability, or, more precisely, in the performance of accountability, in trials that established guilt and imposed punishment in a framework that served both legal and political purposes. For a German field marshal who had commanded forces on Soviet soil, who had been named in documents as having ordered the deaths of German soldiers for offenses as vague as standing around without orders, and who had been the personal favorite of Adolf Hitler himself, the outcome of any Soviet legal proceeding was not genuinely in doubt. He was transported deep into Soviet territory, into the prison system that processed the most significant German prisoners of war. The conditions were nothing like the facilities that held ordinary soldiers. Senior officers and political figures were kept in specific installations, interrogated systematically, required to document their commands, their orders, their knowledge of specific incidents and policies. This was not merely punitive, it was investigative. The Soviets were building cases, assembling evidence, creating the documentary record that would support prosecutions. Schörner was questioned about his orders on the Eastern Front, about the executions he had authorized, about his role in the last months of the war, about his relationship with Hitler's high command, and the political direction of Wehrmacht operations. The interrogations were lengthy and, by the accounts that eventually surfaced in post-war records, deeply thorough. The Soviets had access to captured Wehrmacht documents, to testimony from German prisoners who had served under Schörner's command, and to their own military records of incidents on the front lines. They built their case methodically. Schörner, for his part, appears to have understood very quickly that the framing of his defense would need to navigate the fundamental tension that trapped every senior German officer in post-war legal proceedings. The tension between claiming that they were professional soldiers following legitimate military orders, and the reality that many of those orders had crossed the line into what international law, even in its 1940s formulation, recognized as criminal conduct. The Soviet trial of Ferdinand Schörner, when it eventually came, in 1952, resulted in a sentence of 25 years imprisonment for war crimes. The specific charges centered on the summary executions he had ordered of German soldiers, the hangings, the firing squads, the field courts-martial that had dispensed death with the speed and carelessness of a man who had long since stopped treating human life as something that required careful consideration before it was ended. The 25-year sentence was, in the context of Soviet post-war justice, neither the harshest possible outcome nor an acquittal. It was a judgment that acknowledged the scale of what had been done without reaching for the absolute maximum. What the Soviet imprisonment did to Schörner psychologically is difficult to reconstruct with precision. The years of detention that followed his conviction were years of enforced reflection, of physical confinement, in conditions that bore no resemblance to the outdoor campaigns and mountain fighting that had formed his identity. He was a man built for movement, for action, for the exercise of authority over large numbers of people in extreme environments. In a Soviet prison, he was none of those things. He was a number in a file, a body in a cell, a name on a list that was reviewed periodically by bureaucrats who had no particular interest in his experience of captivity, beyond the question of whether he was still alive and still serving his sentence. The iron that the First World War had put into him must have been tested, in those years, in ways that no enemy had ever managed. There were German prisoners serving sentences alongside him who were also senior figures, officers, officials, men who had occupied significant positions in the machinery of the Third Reich and were now working through their accounting in Soviet custody. Whether Schörner formed any significant relationships with these men, whether they discussed the war and their choices and the weight of what had been done in the name of the state they had served, these are questions that the available historical record does not fully answer. What is known is that he survived, that he maintained his physical health through years of imprisonment that killed others, that the same stubborn, grinding endurance that had carried him through the mountains of Italy in 1917 and the Arctic tundra of Finland in 1942 carried him, in a very different mode, through the cells of a Soviet prison in the 1940s and 50s. He was, in this one quality at least, entirely consistent. Chapter 8, The Long Wait, Prison, Reflection, and the Changing World Outside, __. The world outside Ferdinand Schörner's prison cell was changing at a speed that no one inside could fully track, and the distance between the Germany he had left in 1945 and the Germany that was slowly reassembling itself in the late 1940s and early 1950s was almost impossible to measure from within the Soviet detention system. The Germany he had served was gone in every meaningful sense. The Third Reich, the ideology, the uniforms, the hierarchy, the entire apparatus of the state to which he had devoted his career and his conscience, all of it had been dismantled, condemned, documented, and in the cases of the most visible perpetrators, prosecuted at Nuremberg. The men who had been Schörner's peers and superiors, the names he had moved among in the final years of the war, were either dead, imprisoned, or navigating the complex machinery of post-war German reconstruction with varying degrees of success. The Nuremberg trials had established, for the first time in any binding international legal framework, that following orders was not a sufficient defense for crimes of sufficient magnitude. This was a principle with enormous implications for everyone who had served in the Wehrmacht's upper echelons, and it shaped the legal and moral landscape into which Schörner would eventually be released. It meant that when he finally returned to West Germany, he would not be returning to a blank slate, to a nation willing to accept the argument that professional soldiers had simply done what soldiers do. He would be returning to a country that had, through excruciating public reckoning, begun to understand what its military had participated in, and that was, at least in its official and legal posture, committed to accounting for the most egregious of those participations. His time in Soviet custody was not, of course, entirely static. The political relationship between the Soviet Union and West Germany evolved significantly through the early 1950s. The Federal Republic of Germany, the Western state established in 1949 under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, pursued diplomatic normalization with Moscow throughout the first half of the decade. One of the key humanitarian issues in that normalization was the question of German prisoners of war still held in the Soviet Union. By the mid-1950s, there were still tens of thousands of German soldiers in Soviet captivity, men who had been held not just for war crimes, but simply as prisoners, laborers, and human collateral in the post-war settlement. Adenauer's government pressed the question with increasing urgency and diplomatic skill. In the late summer and autumn of 1955, the Chancellor himself traveled to Moscow for negotiations that resulted in an agreement to repatriate the remaining German prisoners. The political context of this agreement was complex. It involved West Germany establishing formal diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, a step with significant implications for the divided Germany of the Cold War era. But the humanitarian outcome was real. Thousands of German prisoners were returned home, among them the most senior and legally significant figures still held in Soviet custody. Ferdinand Schörner was among those repatriated. In 1955, a decade after his arrest in that Austrian meadow, he returned to West Germany. He was 63 years old. He had spent 10 years as a Soviet prisoner, in conditions that left marks that do not fully show in official records, but that shaped the man who stepped back onto German soil in ways that anyone who met him in those final years could sense immediately. The field marshal's bearing was still present, the physical upright posture, the deliberate manner of someone accustomed to being the most important person in a room, but the energy behind it had been transformed. The fanaticism was quieter now, if it had not entirely departed. The world that fanaticism had served was gone, and the world he was returning to had no use for it. But if Schörner imagined that his release from Soviet custody marked the end of his legal ordeal, he was gravely mistaken. West Germany was not finished with him. The West German legal system, the same system that was, through the 1950s and 60s, prosecuting former Nazi officials, former concentration camp guards, former bureaucrats of the killing machinery, had its own case to make against Schörner, and it rested on different, and in some respects more personal ground than the Soviet proceedings. The Soviet trial had focused on his conduct toward his own soldiers. The West German case would as well, but it was being brought by Germans, in Germany, in front of a German court, and the charge was essentially this, that a German general had murdered German men. The families of soldiers who had been executed under Schörner's orders had not forgotten. Through the decade of his Soviet imprisonment, they had waited. Some had organized, some had gathered evidence, some had submitted testimony to the nascent West German legal authorities, who were beginning, carefully and with great political sensitivity, to examine the conduct of Wehrmacht officers during the war. The cases they brought forward were specific and documented, not abstract accusations of general brutality, but named men, named dates, named incidents where soldiers under Schörner's command had been sentenced to death and killed in circumstances that those bringing the cases argued constituted murder rather than legitimate military justice. Schörner was arrested by West German authorities not long after his return from Soviet captivity. The charges were serious: the unlawful killing of German soldiers. The evidence was extensive. Witnesses were available. Documents from Wehrmacht files had survived the collapse of the regime and had been captured, catalogued, and preserved by Allied authorities, who then made them available to post-war German legal proceedings. The trial that followed was a slow, careful, genuinely contested legal proceeding, very different from the Soviet process that had preceded it. German courts operated within the procedural frameworks of the Federal Republic, and the defense Schörner mounted was the one that was always available to senior officers: that he had acted within the framework of military law as it existed under the Third Reich, that the orders he had issued were consistent with standing regulations, and that he should not be judged retroactively by legal standards that had been imposed after the fact by the victorious powers. The German public watched the trial with the complex mixture of emotions that characterized West Germany's relationship with its own recent past throughout the 1950s. There were those who felt that prosecuting former Wehrmacht officers was an exercise in victor's justice, extended by their own countrymen, that the men who had fought and lost deserved some measure of dignity in their defeat, and some protection from further legal punishment once the main proceedings at Nuremberg were concluded. There were others, soldiers' families, survivors, former subordinates who had been on the receiving end of Schörner's disciplinary regime, who felt that the trial was overdue, that the specific acts being prosecuted were indefensible, regardless of the legal framework in which they had occurred, and that the dignity being claimed by men like Schörner had been forfeited by the acts for which they were now being called to account. The German court found Schörner guilty. The sentence, handed down in the late 1950s, was 4.5 years imprisonment. Combined with the time already served in Soviet custody and accounting for the way the West German legal system calculated such matters, he did not serve the full term. He was released relatively quickly. He was an old man by this point, in his mid-60s, his military career a decade and more in the past. The country he had served, existing now only in the memory of those who had lived through it, and in the documents being assembled by historians who were beginning to understand just how systematic, just how deliberate, just how far-reaching the crimes of the regime had been. Chapter 9. Judgment and its Limits. The West German Trial. The question that the West German trial of Ferdinand Schörner raised, and never fully resolved, in the way that the most important questions rarely are resolved by legal proceedings, was not simply whether the specific acts could be proven. They could. The documentation was solid. The witnesses were credible. The pattern of behavior was consistent across multiple fronts and multiple years. The question the trial raised, and that the German public and legal community wrestled with in its wake, was a deeper one. What was the appropriate punishment for a man who had used the legitimate authority of military command to impose lethal discipline on soldiers in a way that had exceeded any reasonable interpretation of necessity? The sentence of 4.5 years was widely criticized as insufficient. Critics pointed out that Schörner had been responsible for the deaths of multiple German soldiers through orders that he had issued personally, deliberately, and in some cases, in circumstances where there was no plausible military justification for the harshness applied. 4.5 years, even accounting for the Soviet imprisonment already served, seemed, to those critics, to be a sentence that the German legal system had arrived at by weighing something other than pure justice. The politics of the period were unavoidable. The Federal Republic was engaged in the delicate project of building a functioning democratic state out of the rubble of the Third Reich. And that project required drawing some lines about how deeply the prosecution of former military figures would go. Schörner's defense team had argued, and the court had considered, the fundamental difficulty of applying peacetime standards of judicial procedure to decisions made under the extreme conditions of collapsing front lines in the final months of a catastrophic war. This was not an argument that justified what had been done, but it was an argument that complicated the legal question of intent, of whether Schörner had been a deliberate murderer or an extreme disciplinarian operating within a framework that the Third Reich had deliberately constructed to make extreme discipline not just permissible, but mandatory. The Wehrmacht's own legal code in the final period of the war was not the same as the legal code of the Federal Republic. Schörner had operated within a system that expected exactly what he delivered. The men who had written that system were not in the dock alongside him. There was another dimension to the trial that received less public attention, but that was, in some respects, equally important. The question of what Schörner had known about the broader crimes of the regime he had served. The final solution, the industrial murder of Europe's Jewish population, was conducted through a parallel apparatus that ran alongside, but formally separate from the Wehrmacht's combat operations. Senior Wehrmacht commanders occupied positions in the chain of command that brought them into varying degrees of proximity to, and knowledge of, what was being done in the occupied territories their forces controlled. Schörner's army groups had operated in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, in Czechoslovakia, where the killing operations had been conducted. What he knew when he knew it, and what he did or did not do in response, were questions that the trial touched, but did not fully excavate. The post-war German legal proceedings against senior Wehrmacht figures were, across the board, a story of partial accountability. The scale of what had happened was too vast, the number of people involved too large, the documentary record too voluminous, and the political pressures on the young Federal Republic too significant for a comprehensive reckoning to be possible in the time frame available. What emerged instead was a series of individual prosecutions, some successful, some not, that established the principle of accountability without fully operationalizing it. Schörner's trial was one of these. It produced a conviction, a sentence, and a public record, but it did not produce anything like a full accounting of the 15 years during which he had exercised increasing levels of power over the lives of hundreds of thousands of men. The reaction of former soldiers to the trial was divided in ways that reflect the complexity of the German military experience in the Second World War. Some former Wehrmacht soldiers, those who had served on the Eastern Front, who had experienced the culture of summary discipline that Schörner embodied, who had watched comrades threatened or killed for infractions that in any other army would have resulted in a reprimand rather than a death sentence, supported the prosecution. They had their own memories of what it had meant to serve under a commander whose primary tool of leadership was terror. For them, the trial was overdue recognition that something had been genuinely wrong, not just strategically but morally, in the way Schörner had exercised command. Others took a different view, the view that has always complicated the post-war German reckoning with the Wehrmacht, that the army had been fighting a legitimate military war, that whatever individual excesses had occurred needed to be understood in the context of the extreme conditions of the Eastern Front, and that prosecuting former commanders in peacetime, years after the fact, was a form of retroactive justice that served political purposes more than moral ones. This view was never dominant in the formal discourse of the Federal Republic's legal and political institutions, but it had significant social currency, particularly among veterans' organizations and conservative political circles. The tension between these two views would not be resolved by Schörner's trial. It would continue to run through German public life for decades. Ferdinand Schörner himself, throughout the trial, maintained a posture that those who observed it described as combining formal legal cooperation with a fundamental refusal to express what those who had lost relatives under his command wanted most: genuine remorse. He answered questions, he provided information where he was required to. He did not, by any available account, say that what he had done was wrong, in the sense of having been wrong in its essence, only, when pressed, wrong in the sense of having been excessive given particular circumstances. This distinction mattered enormously to the families sitting in the courtroom. It is the distinction between a man who has understood why his actions were indefensible and a man who has simply accepted that the system which authorized them no longer exists to protect him. Whether Schörner's apparent lack of remorse reflected genuine moral blindness, strategic self-protection, or something more complex, a man who had so fully inhabited a system's values that he could not separate himself from them even after the system was gone, is a question that his subsequent behavior in the final years of his life did nothing to fully answer. The trial ended, the sentence was served, and Ferdinand Schörner, once the most feared general in the Wehrmacht, once the Führer's most trusted commander, once the holder of the highest military rank his nation could bestow, walked out of the German legal system into the civilian life of the Federal Republic. He was in his late 60s. He was a convicted war criminal. He was also, in a Germany that was simultaneously building its prosperity and managing its guilt, just another old man from the war years, one of millions, trying to find a way to live in the world that the war had made. The city he returned to was Munich. The city where he had been born. He had come full circle, from the police officer's son on the Bavarian streets, through the mountains of Italy and the tundra of Finland and the burning cities of the Eastern Front and the cells of Soviet and West German prisons, back to the place where it had all begun. Munich, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, was a city in the full stride of West Germany's economic miracle. New buildings going up, cars filling streets that had been rubble a decade before. A prosperous, energetic city, deliberately looking forward rather than back. Schörner moved through it quietly. Nobody put a placard around his neck. Chapter 10. The Man Behind the Medals. Character, Method, and the Psychology of Command, __. To understand Ferdinand Schörner fully, not simply as a collection of events and battles and crimes, but as a human being who made choices across 6 decades of an extraordinary life, it is necessary to spend some time with the question of character. Not the character as his enemies described it, not the character as his admirers in Goebbels's diary entries described it, but the character as it actually appears in the consistent patterns of his behavior across the years of his active career. Because despite the enormous changes in his circumstances, the world wars, the political upheavals, the rise and fall of the regime he served, Schörner was remarkably consistent. The qualities that defined him as a 20-year-old officer in the Bavarian army were recognizably the same qualities that defined him as a field marshal in 1945. What changed was not the character, but the power available to express it, and the moral framework, or its absence, within which that expression occurred. The first and most fundamental quality was physical toughness. Schörner was, throughout his career, a man who pushed his body to extremes and expected those around him to match it. He hiked. He climbed. He appeared at frontline positions that other generals visited only rarely or not at all. His mountain warfare credentials were genuine, not performances of toughness but the real article, built in the Bavarian Alps and the Italian mountains and the Finnish Arctic. This physical quality gave him a form of credibility with combat soldiers that purely staff-oriented generals never possessed. Men could say, whatever else they might say about him, that he was present, that he had seen what they had seen, that the demands he made were ones he was willing to subject himself to. In a military culture that valued harshness, this mattered. The second quality was organizational energy. Schörner was not a strategic visionary. He did not produce the kind of sweeping operational concepts that distinguished the great German commanders of the war. What he had was the capacity to take a disorganized or demoralized formation and impose structure on it rapidly, to identify the immediate priorities in a crisis situation and drive resources toward them with a focus that cut through the institutional inertia that often paralyzed German headquarters in the final years of the war. His army groups, by the accounts of those who served in them, were generally better supplied, better coordinated, and better disciplined in a structural sense than comparable formations under other commanders. The organization worked, the trains ran, the ammunition arrived. In the context of 1944 and 1945, when the German logistical system was disintegrating under pressure from all directions, this was not a minor achievement. The third quality, and the one that makes the other two so much more troubling, was the absolute subordination of everything to the achievement of the objective as defined by the authority above him. Schörner did not question orders. He did not modulate them, soften them, or apply personal judgment about when compliance required too high a price in human terms. He was a conduit for authority, a transmission mechanism by which the demands of the Nazi state passed downward through the chain of command without friction, without the filter of individual conscience that more morally independent commanders occasionally applied. When Hitler ordered positions held to the last man, Schörner held them. When the regime required that examples be made of men who seemed to be failing in their duty, Schörner made the examples. He was, in this sense, the perfect instrument of a system that had chosen to replace moral judgment with ideological compliance. This raises the question that biographers and historians have returned to repeatedly. Was Schörner a true believer or a careerist? Did he actually share the ideological commitments of the Nazi regime, or did he weaponize them as a tool for advancement, performing fanaticism because fanaticism was what the system rewarded? The available evidence suggests the answer is somewhere between the two, and that this in-between position is more disturbing than either extreme would be. He was genuinely a German nationalist of a very old-fashioned authoritarian variety. The political views he held would have fit comfortably in the conservative Bavarian milieu of his upbringing, regardless of whether Hitler had ever been born. The Nazi Party gave those views a more extreme and more institutionalized expression, but the underlying values, national strength, military hierarchy, contempt for weakness, the absolute priority of collective will over individual rights, were authentically his. Where the careerism entered was in the execution. Schörner understood, with remarkable clarity, that under Hitler's personal style of command, the officers who advanced were not those with the best operational records, but those who most completely matched Hitler's psychological requirements: certainty, aggression, loyalty, and the willingness to use extreme measures. He gave Hitler what Hitler needed, not just because he was ordered to, but because giving it was entirely consistent with who he was, and because doing so accelerated his career in ways that satisfied his own considerable ambitions. The true believer and the careerist were, in his case, not competing with each other. They were the same person. His relationship with the men he commanded was, by every account, a study in controlled intimidation. He did not build loyalty through personal connection, through the kind of soldier-general rapport that officers like Erwin Rommel achieved so naturally. He built compliance through fear, through the absolute certainty that failure would be punished, that retreat would be punished, that any appearance of defeatism or weakness would bring consequences that no rational person would choose. This approach worked, in a narrow technical sense, in the specific conditions of the Eastern Front's defensive phase. It produced soldiers who fought in positions they would otherwise have abandoned, who held lines that should by rights have broken. But it did not produce soldiers who trusted their general, who believed he valued their lives, or who would have chosen to serve under him if the choice had been theirs. There is a contrast worth drawing here that is not merely rhetorical. The great commanders of the Second World War, on all sides, shared a quality that transcended their tactical and operational achievements. They were known, by the men who served under them, as people who understood that a soldier's life was not an expendable resource, but a moral responsibility. Erwin Rommel, for all the mythologization that followed his death, was by the accounts of the soldiers who served with him in North Africa, a commander who worried about his men, who sought to achieve his objectives with the minimum cost in lives, who communicated that he saw the people under his command as human beings rather than instruments. Schörner's record in this respect was the opposite. He saw his men as instruments. He spent them freely when objectives required it and punished them savagely when they failed to perform. The relationship was entirely transactional, entirely hierarchical, entirely absent of what the best soldiers in every era have recognized as the essential element of genuine leadership, the acknowledgement that the people being led are owed something. The executions he ordered, and this is the detail that comes up in every serious assessment of his command, were not responses to genuine criminal conduct in the legal sense. They were not punishments for espionage, for collaboration with the enemy, for the kinds of acts that military law in any functioning system recognizes as genuinely criminal. They were, in the large majority of documented cases, punishments for behavior that in any army, not in the grip of a totalitarian collapse, would have been handled through administrative discipline. Stragglers found behind the front, soldiers whose vehicles had broken down, men separated from their units in the chaos of a disintegrating front line. The punishment for these situations, summary execution, displayed publicly to intimidate others, reveals not just a commander operating under extreme pressure, but a man who had lost, or perhaps had never possessed, any meaningful sense of proportion between human life and military necessity. Yet he returned to Munich. He lived into old age. He was not remembered in the way that the most notorious architects of the Holocaust were remembered, was not the face on a wanted poster, was not hunted across continents by Nazi hunters, was not the subject of the kind of continuing international legal attention that followed figures like Adolf Eichmann or Klaus Barbie. He occupied a particular category of the German past, not the ideological masterminds, not the men who designed or operated the killing machinery, but the military professionals who had served the regime with enthusiasm and ruthlessness, and who, after the legal reckoning of the post-war years, were allowed to fade into the civilian population of the Federal Republic. The question of whether this outcome represented justice is one that different people, with different connections to the events in question, would answer very differently. Chapter 11. What History Remembers. Legacy, Assessment, and the Long Shadow. History does not always award its judgments quickly. For some figures, the most visible perpetrators of the most visible crimes, the verdict arrives within years of the events themselves, in courtrooms with international audiences and documented proceedings that establish the record for generations. For others, the judgment is slower, more dispersed across decades of scholarly research, memoir literature, survivors' testimony, and the gradual accumulation of evidence that eventually makes a clear picture possible even where the original legal proceedings were incomplete. Ferdinand Schörner falls into the second category. The full weight of historical assessment fell on him not in the 1940s or even the 1950s, but over the following decades, as German and international historians gained access to the archival record, and as the survivors of his command, both the soldiers who had served under him and the families of those who had been killed by his orders, added their voices to the historical conversation. The scholarly literature on Schörner, and there is a substantial body of it, in German primarily but with significant contributions in English, Russian, and other languages, converges on a portrait that is consistent with the documents and is not flattering. The consensus is that he was, operationally, a capable defensive commander in conditions of extreme adversity, but that his capabilities in this area were entirely inseparable from, and in many respects dependent on, the terror he imposed on his own troops. Strip away the hangings and the summary executions, and the climate of lethal intimidation, and what remains is a good logistician and an energetic presence at the front, qualities that were valuable but not extraordinary in the Wehrmacht's officer corps of the 1940s. the terror was not incidental to his effectiveness. It was the mechanism of it. His relationship with Hitler stands as one of the defining features of his historical image, and it is a relationship that reveals something important about how the Third Reich functioned at its upper levels in the final years of the war. Hitler's personal patronage of Schörner was not based on strategic insight or operational brilliance. It was based on something more primitive and more direct, the certainty that Schörner would do what he was told, that he would not retreat when retreat was rational, that he would not advise Hitler to change course when Hitler's course was disastrous, and that he would maintain the performance of confidence and resolution, even as the objective situation made those qualities suicidal. In this sense, Schörner's rise tells us less about Schörner as an individual and more about the system that selected him, a system that had, by 1944, filtered out or removed from influence most of the officers capable of offering honest counsel, leaving at the top those who were most useful to a leadership that had chosen delusion over reality. The comparison with other senior Wehrmacht commanders of the period is instructive. Erich von Manstein, widely regarded by military historians as the most operationally gifted German general of the war, was relieved of command in March of 1944 after repeatedly offering Hitler advice that was accurate but unwelcome. Gerd von Rundstedt was removed multiple times for similar reasons. Heinz Guderian, the great panzer theorist, clashed repeatedly with Hitler's headquarters and was eventually dismissed as well. The pattern is consistent. Officers whose professional judgment led them to contradict Hitler's wishes were systematically removed, and their places were taken by officers whose first loyalty was to Hitler's psychological requirements rather than to military reality. Schörner was the ultimate product of this selection process, the man left standing when all the others had been filtered out. The historical judgment on what this meant for the soldiers under his command is equally unambiguous, even if the legal judgment was incomplete. The men who died under Schörner's disciplinary orders in the final months of the war died not in battle, not against the enemy, but at the hands of their own chain of command, in circumstances that served no genuine military purpose. The positions he ordered held after the general surrender had been signed resulted in 3 more days of casualties. Men killed in Czechoslovakia between the 8th and 11th of May 1945, after Germany had officially ceased to fight, because Schörner had ordered resistance to continue rather than face the complexity and accountability that surrender would have brought immediately. These were, in the most direct sense, unnecessary deaths. Men killed not by the war, but by one man's choices in the war's final hours. Schörner died in Munich on the 2nd of July, 1973. He was 81 years old. He had outlived Hitler by 28 years, outlived the Third Reich by nearly 3 decades, outlived the Soviet Union's prosecution of him and the West German prosecution of him, and the public debates about his legacy that had accompanied both. He died in the same city where he had been born, in a country so transformed from the one he had devoted his life to that the transformation might as well have been complete replacement. The Federal Republic of Germany in 1973, prosperous, democratic, anchored in NATO and the beginnings of European integration, conducting its ongoing reckoning with its own past through legal proceedings, education, and the slow work of cultural memory, bore essentially no resemblance to the Germany of his active life. He was a man whose world had been buried under a new one, and who had lived long enough to see the burial complete. No state funeral was given, no official military honors. The man who had received from Adolf Hitler the highest decoration available to any German officer, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, died as a private citizen, in private circumstances, without the ceremonial acknowledgement that the highest military rank in the German order would once have guaranteed. This was appropriate, in the judgment of the Federal Republic's institutions, and of most of the historians who have examined his career. The rank and the decorations had been products of a state whose purposes were criminal. Honoring them would have been honoring those purposes. Schörner died with his history, and history was enough. What his legacy teaches, if legacy is the right word for what a man like Schörner leaves, is a lesson about institutional culture and individual moral responsibility that remains, more than 80 years after the events in question, as relevant as it was when it was written in the blood of the men who served under him. The lesson is this: a system can create the conditions in which atrocity becomes routine, in which extreme cruelty is not just permitted but rewarded, in which the people who perform the cruelty can tell themselves, and often believe, that they are serving a legitimate and necessary purpose. But the individual who operates within that system is not, on that account, relieved of moral responsibility for their choices. Schörner was not forced to hang soldiers for standing near a disabled vehicle. He was not forced to continue resistance after the surrender. He chose these things. The system encouraged the choices, but the hands that made them were his. The Federal Republic of Germany that buried him, quietly, without ceremony, understood this distinction. It is worth understanding still. Chapter 12. The Wider Stage, where Schörner fits in, the history of the war, _. To place Ferdinand Schörner properly in the full history of the Second World War, not just as an individual story, but as a figure who illuminates larger patterns, it is necessary to step back from the particular details of his career and look at the broader picture in which he operated. The war itself, in its European theatre, lasted from September of 1939 to May of 1945, 5 years and 8 months of the most destructive conflict the continent had ever experienced. A conflict that killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people by the best available scholarly estimates, displaced hundreds of millions more, destroyed the institutional infrastructure of multiple nations, and reshaped the political geography of the continent for the remainder of the 20th century. Schörner was one figure within this vastness, significant, but significant in a particular way, as an illumination of a specific mechanism rather than a shaper of the war's outcome. The Eastern Front, where Schörner spent the decisive years of his active career, was the largest and most lethal theatre of the entire war. The conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union, from June of 1941 to May of 1945, consumed more lives, destroyed more material, and occupied more territory than all the other fronts of the Second World War combined. The Soviet Union lost somewhere between 26 and 27 million people in the conflict, a number so large that it remains, even now, almost impossible to fully comprehend. Germany lost more than 5 million military dead on the Eastern Front alone, in addition to the millions who died in captivity, in the bombing of German cities, and in the final battles on German soil. The Eastern Front was not a war in any ordinary sense of the word. It was a mutual catastrophe of civilizational scale, conducted with deliberate brutality by both sides, driven by ideological hatreds that had been systematically cultivated for years before the first shots were fired. Schörner's career on the Eastern Front, from his posting to the Arctic sectors in 1941 through his command of Army Group Center in 1945, traced the full arc of Germany's experience in that theatre. The early advances, the stalling at Moscow, the catastrophe of Stalingrad, the grinding defensive battles of the middle years, the final collapse. He was present at every stage of this arc, not as its architect, but as one of its more aggressive instruments. His promotions tracked the desperate promotions of the Wehrmacht's final phase, the elevation of men willing to do what needed to be done, whatever the cost, because the men who had asked about the cost had already been removed from command. By the time he reached Field Marshal, the rank was an epitaph as much as a promotion, the last conferral of an honor that the regime could no longer make meaningful. The question of how Schörner's methods compared to those of his Soviet counterparts is one that historians have examined, sometimes in the context of arguments about moral equivalence that are ultimately less illuminating than they might first appear. It is true that Soviet military discipline in the Second World War was also brutal. The infamous Order 227, issued in July of 1942 under Stalin's personal authority, imposed the death penalty for unauthorized retreat and established the blocking detachments that shot retreating Soviet soldiers from behind. It is true that Soviet commanders in the final years of the war were also willing to spend their soldiers' lives at a rate that their Western Allied counterparts would have found unacceptable. The comparison reveals that extreme military pressure, combined with totalitarian political authority, tends to produce similar outcomes regardless of the ideology doing the pressing. But the comparison does not, as it is sometimes used to do, neutralize the judgment on Schörner's conduct. The context of the Eastern Front's brutality does not eliminate the individual moral and legal responsibility for specific acts. The fact that Soviet blocking detachments were also killing Soviet soldiers does not make the German field marshal who hanged German soldiers for standing near a broken vehicle anything other than what the courts of two countries determined he was: a man who committed acts that exceeded the bounds of legitimate military discipline and that constituted crimes under any legal framework capable of recognizing the basic rights of the persons subjected to them. The comparison illuminates a pattern. It does not excuse a man. What Schörner does illuminate, usefully, for anyone trying to understand the Second World War, not as a collection of battles and dates, but as a human story about power and its misuse, is the mechanism by which ordinary institutional ambition can be transformed, by the right system, in the right conditions, into something monstrous. He was not a monster in the sense of a man who arrived at monstrousness through extraordinary wickedness. He was a man of unremarkable moral imagination, who was given, by the specific historical conditions of the Third Reich, enough power and enough ideological permission to act on the most extreme implications of values that were, in their essence, quite common: the belief in hierarchy, the contempt for weakness, the absolute priority of the collective over the individual. These values exist in every society, in softer forms, as ordinary conservative dispositions. What the Third Reich did was remove the softer forms and replace them with the extreme ones, and give men like Schörner the authority to act on the extreme versions without legal or moral restraint. This is not a comfortable historical lesson, because it is not a lesson that identifies the problem with a specific, unusual type of person, a monster, an aberration, a figure so extraordinary in his wickedness that his story is a warning about an exceptional danger rather than a systemic one. The lesson of Ferdinand Schörner is more unsettling than that. It is a lesson about what ordinary authority, combined with ordinary ambition, combined with the removal of ordinary moral constraints, is capable of producing. It is a lesson that can be drawn from the history of any system that chooses institutional loyalty over individual conscience, that rewards compliance above wisdom, and that confuses the willingness to cause harm with the capacity to provide leadership. The last person to hold the highest rank in the military of a state that had killed more people in more systematic and more deliberate ways than any state in the history of the world to that point. He held that rank for a matter of days, from the 5th of April 1945 to the general surrender on the 8th of May, a few weeks in which the title meant nothing in military terms and everything in symbolic ones. The symbol it represented was not triumph, but the final, committed, unyielding loyalty of a man who had built his entire identity on service to a state that was, even as it promoted him, ceasing to exist. There is something almost classical in the symmetry of it, the highest honor arriving at the moment of total collapse, the ultimate reward given to the man who had given everything to something that had nothing left to give. That image, Schörner receiving his promotion in a bunker while the Reich above it crumbled, then changing into civilian clothes and flying to safety 10 days later, is as complete a statement of the distance between the performance of loyalty and its substance as any in the history of the war. He spent years threatening and executing men he accused of cowardice. His own final act was to flee. He spent a career insisting on the absolute priority of the military mission over individual self-preservation. His own final decision was individual self-preservation over the military mission. He built an identity on iron discipline and unbreakable will. The will broke at the first moment it was genuinely tested, the moment when there was no longer any authority above him to perform for, any system to reward his fanaticism, any placard left to hang around anyone's neck. Munich received him in his old age without ceremony. He walked its streets as a private citizen, a convicted criminal, an old man from the war. He was visible to those who knew who he was. He was invisible to the city around him, absorbed into the anonymity of civilian life, with the efficiency that the post-war German social settlement provided to people who would otherwise have required continuous reckoning. He attended veterans' meetings in the 1960s, where he was observed by journalists who noted that he remained, in manner and bearing, the general, upright, precise, dismissive of any suggestion that the conduct he had been convicted of was genuinely wrong. He was an old man who had not changed his mind. He was a man whose mind had never been the kind that changed. He is buried in Munich. The grave is unmarked in the public consciousness, unvisited by pilgrims, uncelebrated. The city around it has changed almost beyond recognition from the one that formed him. The country in which it sits has chosen, over the 80 years since the events of his career, a path that rejects almost everything he stood for. That choice, slow, imperfect, contested, and genuine, is itself a form of judgment on Ferdinand Schörner and on the system that made him what he was. History does not always speak loudly. Sometimes it speaks in the simple fact of what endures and what does not. You have been listening to the complete history of Ferdinand Schörner, and we have now reached the halfway point of this documentary. 12 chapters behind us, 6 more chapters still ahead. In the final 6, we will examine the broader Wehrmacht command culture that Schörner both shaped and was shaped by. We will look at what his soldiers said about him, in memoirs, in testimony, in the letters they wrote to families that often arrived without their authors. We will examine the specific campaigns of his Army Group Center in the final spring of 1945 in greater detail. We will spend time with the question that has never been fully settled, whether the soldiers who died under Schörner's orders in those last weeks have ever received the recognition that the ordinary machinery of wartime commemoration denied them. And we will close with a final reflection on what the complete arc of one man's extraordinary and terrible life reveals about the war that made him and the peace that outlasted him. If you have been listening through the night, thank you for staying with this story. If you are just arriving, the full documentary begins at the very first chapter. Subscribe so you receive the final 6 chapters the moment they are published. Like this video if this kind of long-form, deeply researched history is what you come here for. We will see you in Chapter 13, Chapter 13, The Soldiers Who Served Under Him, Voices from the Ranks, History has a tendency to record the powerful and forget the powerless. The archives are full of the orders Ferdinand Schörner issued, the documents, the directives, the promotion records, the after-action reports, but they are far less full of the voices of the men who received those orders, the men who lived and died under the particular climate of command that Schörner created wherever he went. To understand what his leadership actually meant, not in the abstract language of military assessment, but in the lived, daily, visceral reality of service, it is necessary to make a deliberate effort to recover those voices, to pull them from the margins of the official record and place them at the center of the story, where they belong. Because the story of Ferdinand Schörner is ultimately not his story, it is theirs. What the soldiers who served in his formations remembered, and what the post-war accounts gathered from veterans of the Eastern Front consistently describe, is not primarily the tactical decisions or the operational outcomes. It is the atmosphere. Every army, every command, generates a kind of weather, a prevailing emotional climate that shapes how soldiers feel in the morning, how they move through the day, what they fear at night. In most armies, even in the most extreme conditions, there is some ambient understanding that the chain of command, however demanding, draws a line at a certain point. That a soldier who is genuinely trying, who has genuinely lost his unit in the chaos of a collapsing front, who has genuinely run out of ammunition and been left without orders for 3 days, will receive some benefit of the doubt. In Schörner's formations, that ambient understanding did not exist. Veterans who spoke about serving under Schörner, in memoirs published in the 1950s and 60s, in oral history projects conducted by German universities and historical institutes in later decades, in the testimony gathered during legal proceedings, return repeatedly to the same theme. The fear, they said, ran in 2 directions simultaneously. In front of them was the enemy, the Red Army, with its overwhelming numbers, its artillery, its aircraft, its seemingly inexhaustible capacity to absorb casualties and press forward regardless. Behind them was Schörner's disciplinary apparatus. The choice they faced was not between safety and danger, but between 2 different kinds of danger, and the nature of the danger behind them, the certainty of deliberate, organized punishment for anything perceived as insufficiently aggressive, shaped their behavior in ways that had nothing to do with military effectiveness and everything to do with self-preservation against their own side. One of the most consistently repeated elements in veteran accounts concerns the display of executed men. Schörner understood, as commanders in every era have understood, that punishment functions as a deterrent only when it is visible, when those who are meant to be deterred can see its consequences. He therefore made the executions visible, with a deliberateness that went beyond any purely military rationale. Bodies were left hanging for days, sometimes at crossroads, sometimes at the entrances to villages, always in positions where passing troops could not fail to see them. The placards, the hand-lettered signs accusing the dead of cowardice and desertion, were written in large, legible text. The message was clear, and it was directed not at the dead, but at the living. This is what happens here. This is what Schörner's army does to men who are found in the wrong place at the wrong time. The psychological impact of this practice on the men who encountered it is described in veteran accounts, with a consistency that makes it impossible to dismiss as embellishment or exaggeration. Soldiers who had been fighting continuously for months or years, who were exhausted past any civilian understanding of the word, who had watched friends die beside them, and had managed their own grief and fear through the mechanisms that combat soldiers develop over time. These men, already operating at the edge of their psychological capacity, were confronted daily with the evidence that their own general viewed them as potential criminals, not as human beings whose service was valued and whose lives mattered, but as instruments that would be discarded the moment they appeared to be failing in their function, and discarded publicly, violently, as a lesson to other instruments. The effect on unit cohesion, the invisible but absolutely essential quality that makes a group of individuals into a fighting formation capable of sustained collective action, was, in many accounts, corrosive. Soldiers who did not trust each other, who feared that a comrade might report a moment of weakness to the rear area courts, who calculated every decision in terms of how it might appear to Schörner's disciplinary apparatus, rather than how it served the immediate tactical situation. These soldiers fought differently from soldiers who trusted their commander's fundamental good faith. They fought more rigidly, more defensively in the psychological sense, with less of the creative adaptability and mutual support that actually determines whether small unit actions succeed or fail. Schörner created soldiers who were afraid to fail. He did not create soldiers who were inspired to succeed. The distinction, in the brutal mathematics of the Eastern Front's final phase, may have cost more lives than it saved. There were soldiers, it must be acknowledged, whose accounts of Schörner were more equivocal than pure condemnation. Some veterans noted that his presence at the front was genuine, that he appeared in positions where generals were rarely seen, that he shared the physical conditions of the soldiers in a way that commanded a grudging respect, even from men who feared him. Some noted that his organizational demands, as brutal as their enforcement was, produced results. Supply lines that functioned when other formations were starving, ammunition that arrived when other units were firing their last rounds. The basic material prerequisites of military survival maintained even as the wider campaign collapsed around them. These are not trivial qualities. In the conditions of Army Group Center in 1945, competent logistics was the difference between survival and encirclement. But these partial positive assessments exist in the accounts alongside, and always qualified by, the other memory, the memory of the hangings, the summary courts, the climate of terror. They coexist the way that complex human experiences always coexist with their contradictions, without resolving into a simple judgment. The men who served under Schörner did not, in their later accounts, simplify him the way that popular history sometimes simplifies figures from the past. They remembered a real person, one capable of genuine physical courage and genuine organizational effectiveness, and also capable of ordering the death of a man for standing near a broken vehicle. They held both things simultaneously because both things were true. It is only history that needs to make a final judgment. And the judgment it makes, the judgment that has settled over the decades into the scholarly consensus, is that the terror was not incidental, not justified, and not morally separable from the man who chose to impose it. The families of the men who were executed under Schörner's orders were not veterans. They were civilians, wives, parents, siblings, children who received, in the final months of the war, notifications that their husbands and sons and brothers had been killed not by the enemy, but by their own army, under circumstances that the official communications often obscured or distorted. Some families received no notification at all. Some learned the truth only years later, through the legal proceedings that followed the war, when the documentary record was examined and the specific incidents reconstructed. Some families never learned the full truth. The gap between what they were told and what actually happened, between the official language of the Third Reich's bureaucratic death notices and the reality of a summary execution on the order of a general who thought their son was standing around too casually, is its own form of violence, quieter than the physical act but lasting longer. The soldiers' voices, gathered across decades of historical scholarship, are the most important counterweight to any assessment of Schörner that begins and ends with operational effectiveness. They remind us that military history is not only about campaigns and command decisions and the movement of formations across maps. It is about people, the individuals who occupied the positions on those maps, who moved through the terrain that the arrows on the charts represent, who felt the cold and the hunger and the fear that no after-action report ever captures. Ferdinand Schörner commanded those people. He had absolute authority over their lives and their deaths. What he did with that authority, the choices he made with the power those hundreds of thousands of people had been placed under, is the measure of him that matters most, and it is a measure that the operational record alone can never provide. Chapter 14. Army Group Center's Final Spring, the Last Campaign, _. The spring of 1945 was unlike any spring that had come before it in the 6 years of the European War. The strategic situation had passed the point of genuine military contest and entered a different phase entirely, one in which the question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but only how long the defeat would take to complete, and what shape the final collapse would take, and at what price in additional lives the inevitable outcome would be purchased. The armies that were still fighting, on both sides of the remaining front lines, did so in a context that had changed irrevocably. Germany's western borders were being crossed by American, British, and other Allied forces. Its eastern borders had been breached months before. Berlin was encircled and under bombardment. The political leadership was underground in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing orders to formations that no longer existed and directing counterattacks with armies that were figments of a command system that had long since lost any meaningful connection to the reality on the ground. Into this context, Ferdinand Schörner commanded Army Group Center, the largest remaining coherent German military formation still fighting on the Eastern Front. The term coherent requires qualification. The formations under his command in the spring of 1945 were coherent in the sense that they maintained some organizational structure, some functioning chain of command, some capacity for coordinated defensive action. They were not coherent in the sense of being adequately supplied, adequately reinforced, adequately equipped for sustained operations against an enemy whose material superiority had now become overwhelming. The soldiers were exhausted. The equipment was worn beyond its service life. The logistical system that Schörner had maintained with characteristic iron discipline in the earlier phases of the campaign was fraying under pressures that organizational energy alone could not overcome. His army group was responsible for the defense of Silesia, the industrial heartland of eastern Germany, with its coal mines and factories, and for the approaches to Bohemia and Moravia, the territory that would become Czechoslovakia. Hitler's standing orders were absolute. Every city was a fortress. Every position would be held. There would be no authorized retreat. Schörner received these orders and passed them down the chain of command with his usual uncompromising energy. The cities of Silesia were declared fortresses and garrisoned for defense. The civilian populations of these cities found themselves living in fortresses that military necessity had converted from places of ordinary life into positions to be defended at whatever cost the defenders determined necessary, regardless of the cost to the people living there. The operations of Army Group Center in the spring of 1945 unfolded in a pattern that was, by that stage of the war, grimly familiar on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces advanced. German defensive lines bent, buckled, and broke under the weight of superior numbers and firepower. Local counterattacks, ordered by Schörner with his customary demands for maximum effort, sometimes succeeded in stabilizing a section of the front temporarily before the Soviet pressure resumed and the ground was lost again. The scale of the Soviet advantage in this period was so great that even the most determined defensive effort could only slow the advance, not halt it. Every day that Army Group Center held its positions was a day purchased at the cost of additional German and Soviet casualties on a front that had already consumed lives beyond counting. Schörner's management of this final campaign was, by the assessment of military historians who have examined the period in detail, a mixture of genuine competence and catastrophic misjudgment. The genuine competence was operational, his ability to maintain some degree of organizational coherence in formations that were being ground down from multiple directions simultaneously, to allocate his limited reserves with reasonable tactical effectiveness, to keep the logistical system functioning at a minimum level that prevented immediate complete disintegration. These were not trivial achievements. Other German formations in the same period collapsed far more quickly under comparable pressure. Army Group Center held together, in a tactical sense, longer than its situation arguably warranted. The catastrophic misjudgment was strategic, and it was directly connected to Schörner's relationship with Hitler and his systematic preference for telling Hitler what Hitler wanted to hear, rather than what the situation actually required. In the final weeks of April of 1945, as Soviet forces were completing the encirclement of Berlin, a debate was occurring in the highest levels of the German command about whether the Red Army's primary objective was the German capital or whether it would swing south toward Prague. Schörner argued, and continued to argue as events made the argument increasingly untenable, that the main Soviet thrust would go south, toward Czechoslovakia, and that the defense of that territory was therefore the critical priority. Hitler enthusiastically accepted this assessment because it matched his own intuition and because it provided justification for maintaining strong German forces in the south, rather than redirecting them to the hopeless battle for Berlin. The assessment was wrong. The main Soviet effort went to Berlin, as professional military judgment based on observable Soviet force concentrations had been indicating for weeks. The forces Schörner maintained in Czechoslovakia, on the basis of his incorrect prediction, did not save Berlin. They did not decisively affect the battle for the German capital. What they did was ensure that Army Group Center remained in the field, fighting, maintaining resistance in a theater that had ceased to be strategically relevant, well past the point at which the political decision to end the war had been made. And when the end came, when the unconditional surrender was signed and the ceasefire took effect, those forces were still in the field in Czechoslovakia, still receiving orders from Schörner's headquarters, still being told that resistance was required. The 3 days between the general surrender on the 8th of May and the final cessation of Army Group Center's resistance on the 11th of May, 1945, represent one of the most damaging episodes of Schörner's entire career in terms of the direct, attributable harm caused by his decisions. In those 3 days, German and Soviet soldiers continued to die in Czechoslovakia because the orders flowing from Schörner's headquarters, confused, contradictory, and ultimately reflecting a commander more concerned with his own situation than with the welfare of his soldiers, failed to clearly and immediately implement the ceasefire that the surrender had mandated. Some units received ceasefire orders promptly. Others fought on for days longer than the surrender required, in some cases because they were genuinely not informed, and in others because the informing was done with a slowness that served no purpose except the avoidance of the immediate accountability that surrender would have brought. The Czech population witnessed the final spasms of Army Group Center's resistance with understandable complexity of feeling. Czechoslovakia had been occupied since 1939. The annexation of the Sudetenland in the autumn of 1938 had been followed by the occupation of the rest of the country in March of 1939, and the years of occupation had left wounds in Czech society that would shape the country's politics and social life for decades. The presence of a large German army group on Czech soil in May of 1945 was not experienced simply as a military fact. It was experienced as the continuation, into the war's final days, of an occupation that had defined 6 years of Czech life. The battles of those final days, however small in the context of the broader war, were fought on territory that was not Germany's, among a population that had been waiting years for liberation, and they added to the already enormous account of harm that the German military presence in that country had accumulated. The final operational order of Schörner's career was, appropriately enough, an order that was never fully executed, the instruction for Army Group Center to lay down its arms, issued imprecisely and incompletely at a moment when the man issuing it was already preparing his own escape to Austrian territory, his uniform packed away and his civilian clothes prepared. The army he commanded did eventually stop fighting. The men, those who were not killed in those final days, and those who were not captured by Soviet forces in the chaos of the collapse, made their way west as best they could, seeking surrender to American forces rather than Soviet ones wherever the geography permitted. Many succeeded, many did not. The army that Ferdinand Schörner had terrorized and driven and organized and threatened through the final months of the most destructive war in history dissolved into the European spring, scattered across the ruins of the Reich, without ceremony, without orderly conclusion, without any of the rituals that military history usually provides for the end of great campaigns. It simply stopped. Chapter 15. The other commanders, Schörner, in comparison, No figure in history exists in isolation. To understand what Ferdinand Schörner was, as a commander, as a leader, as a human being exercising power over other human beings, it is necessary to place him alongside the other commanders of the Second World War, not to perform a ranking exercise, but to identify what was particular about him, what was representative of a broader type, and what his specific choices reveal when set against the range of choices that the same conditions elicited from different men. The Second World War produced on all sides a wide range of command styles and moral postures, from commanders of genuine greatness to commanders of genuine infamy, with the large majority occupying the complicated middle ground where professional competence and moral ambiguity coexist in the way they usually do in human affairs. The comparison with Erwin Rommel, the officer whose path crossed Schörner's most personally at Caporetto in 1917, is the one that historians return to most often, because the contrast is so instructive and so clearly illustrates what specifically was distinctive about Schörner's approach to command. Rommel and Schörner shared certain surface characteristics. Both were non-Prussian Germans. Both came from relatively modest backgrounds. Both built their reputations on personal courage and frontline presence, rather than on the staff work and theoretical scholarship that the traditional officer corps valued most highly. But their approaches to the exercise of command over their own soldiers were as different as their historical legacies. Rommel was known, by the soldiers who served under him and by the enemy forces he fought against, as a commander who saw his soldiers as people, who communicated, even in the most extreme conditions, a genuine sense that their lives mattered, that he was not indifferent to the cost of the operations he ordered. Schörner communicated the opposite. The contrast with Walter Model, the other senior Wehrmacht commander most often compared to Schörner, and the one whose Eastern Front career most closely paralleled his in terms of defensive operations and Hitler's personal favor, is equally revealing, though in a somewhat different way. Model, like Schörner, was an aggressive, demanding commander who drove his soldiers hard and who maintained positions that other commanders would have abandoned. Model, like Schörner, was trusted by Hitler precisely because his personality matched Hitler's own conviction that will alone could reverse the tide of a lost war. But Model's harshness, by the accounts available in the historical literature, was primarily directed at achieving military objectives rather than at imposing exemplary discipline through terror. Model was feared. Model was demanding, in ways that soldiers often resented. But the pattern of summary executions, of soldiers hanged at crossroads with placards, of men killed for standing in the wrong place, this pattern was far less consistently associated with Model's commands than with Schörner's. On the Allied side, the comparison that is sometimes drawn, usually in the context of arguments about moral equivalence, is with Soviet commanders like Georgy Zhukov, whose operational brilliance was accompanied by a willingness to spend soldiers' lives at a rate that his Western Allied counterparts found shocking, and who operated within a Soviet military culture that included its own brutal disciplinary practices. Zhukov was undeniably a great operational commander, perhaps the greatest of the Second World War in terms of the scope and consistency of his achievements. He was also, by any candid assessment, a man capable of ordering attacks that he knew would cost staggering casualties when the strategic situation seemed to require them. The parallel with Schörner's casualness about human life has some surface validity, but the comparison ultimately breaks down on the critical question of purpose. Zhukov spent soldiers' lives in pursuit of military objectives. Schörner killed soldiers as a disciplinary performance. The distinction is not a technicality, it is the difference between operational ruthlessness and command terror. The commanders of the Western Allied forces, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, Patton, operated within a fundamentally different ethical and legal framework regarding the treatment of their own soldiers, one that reflected both the different political cultures of their societies and the different relationship between democratic militaries and the states they served. American and British soldiers had legal protections that German soldiers in the Wehrmacht's final phase had effectively lost, and the commanders of those American and British forces operated within institutional cultures that, for all their imperfections, maintained some meaningful external accountability. The comparison is not intended to idealize Allied commanders. There were failures of command, instances of unnecessary harshness, and specific episodes in every army's history that do not reflect well on the individuals involved. But the systematic, deliberate, institutionalized use of execution as a motivational tool, the Schörner method, had no equivalent in any Allied command in the Western theater. What the comparisons ultimately reveal is that Schörner occupied a specific position in the spectrum of Second World War command. Not at the extreme of incompetence, he was not a Paulus, paralyzed by the situation and unable to act, but at an extreme of a different kind. He was a commander who had resolved the fundamental tension of military leadership in its most negative possible way. Military leadership always involves tension between the welfare of the individual soldier and the requirements of the mission. Every commander must navigate that tension, and the navigation determines, more than anything else, whether the soldiers under command experience their commander as a legitimate authority or as an oppressor. Schörner resolved the tension entirely in favor of the mission, or more precisely, in favor of the appearance of fulfilling the mission, which in the Third Reich's final phase was indistinguishable from the performance of compliance with Hitler's requirements. The soldier, in Schörner's framework, was an instrument. The instrument that failed was replaced. The replacement was public and lethal, because publicity and lethality were the only management tools he trusted. The German officer corps of the Second World War was not monolithic. It contained men of every moral type, men who resisted, actively or passively, the worst demands of the regime, men who participated in the active conspiracy against Hitler that culminated in the assassination attempt of the 20th of July 1944, men who managed, somehow, to maintain their professional integrity and some degree of personal decency in conditions that made both enormously difficult, and men who, like Schörner, embraced the regime's demands and fulfilled them with an enthusiasm that went beyond the minimum required. Understanding Schörner requires understanding that he was a choice, not an inevitability, that the system that produced him also produced others who made different choices, and that the comparison between Schörner and those others is the most effective way of establishing where his personal moral responsibility lay. The assassination attempt of the 20th of July, 1944, the bomb placed in Hitler's conference room at the Wolf's Lair by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators, is one of the clearest illustration points in this argument. The men involved in that conspiracy were Wehrmacht officers, men who had served the same regime, worn the same uniform, sworn the same oath that Schörner had sworn. They reached a different conclusion. They decided, at enormous personal risk, with full knowledge of the consequences if they failed, that the obligation to their country and to human decency outweighed the obligation of military obedience to an authority that had forfeited any legitimate claim to that obedience. Schörner, when asked about the July plot in subsequent years, condemned it. He condemned it not as a failed operational enterprise, but as a fundamental betrayal. This tells us everything about the basis of his loyalty. It was not loyalty to Germany, not loyalty to the soldiers under his command, not loyalty to any principle that might have been weighed against the demands of obedience. It was loyalty to Hitler personally, to the authority that authority represented, to the system of absolute command that had elevated him and that he embodied. In the years after the war, as German society worked through its complicated relationship with the Wehrmacht's record, the distinction between following orders and making choices became one of the central moral and legal questions of the post-war reckoning. The Nuremberg Principles established, and the West German legal system subsequently affirmed, that the existence of an order does not eliminate personal moral responsibility for its execution when the order requires actions that a reasonable person would recognize as criminal. Schörner's defense, implicit in his conduct during the trials, and explicit in his statements to those who encountered him in later years, was essentially that everything he had done was covered by the orders he had received and the legal framework under which he had operated. The courts rejected this defense. History has continued to reject it. The rejection rests on the same foundation, that between the order and the act stands a person, and the person must answer for the act. The legacy of the comparison, the exercise of placing Schörner alongside other commanders and finding the specific coordinates of his position in the moral map of Second World War leadership, is ultimately a contribution to a larger argument about what military command is and what it requires. It requires professional competence, certainly. It requires physical courage in the specific conditions of combat. It requires organizational ability, the capacity to impose structure on chaos, and direct resources toward objectives under pressure. Schörner had all of these qualities in real measure. What it also requires, what distinguishes command from domination, authority from coercion, leadership from terror, is the recognition that the people being led are ends in themselves, not merely means to a commander's ends. This is the quality that Schörner lacked. Its absence is why the operational achievements of his career rest, in the final historical assessment, on a foundation of sand. Chapter 16. The Soldiers Who Died, the Nameless and the Forgotten. There is a category of casualty in the Second World War that the histories of battles and campaigns rarely count, or count only imprecisely. The soldiers who died not in battle, but because of their own commanders. Every army in every major war produces these deaths. Soldiers executed for cowardice or desertion or mutiny. Soldiers killed in disciplinary actions. Soldiers whose deaths are recorded in administrative files rather than on the maps that historians draw afterward. In the German army of the Second World War, this category was very large. The Wehrmacht executed, by the most careful scholarly estimates available, somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 of its own soldiers during the course of the conflict, a number that vastly exceeds the execution rate of any Western Allied army, though it falls short of the Soviet practice under Stalin's most extreme orders. Ferdinand Schörner was responsible for a significant proportion of those deaths, concentrated in the final year of the war. The individuals who died under Schörner's disciplinary orders did not, for the most part, leave behind detailed records of who they were. Military bureaucracy, in the Third Reich's final phase, was not carefully maintained. Summary executions were sometimes documented and sometimes not. The records that survived the collapse were incomplete, scattered across multiple archives, and often deliberately obscured by the oblique language of official communications that preferred euphemism to clarity. The legal proceedings against Schörner in the Soviet Union in 1952 and in West Germany in the late 1950s established specific cases, specific names, specific incidents with documentary or testimonial support sufficient for criminal prosecution. But these established cases are understood by historians to represent only a fraction of the total number of deaths attributable to his orders. The families of these men carried their loss in ways that differed fundamentally from the grief of families who had lost soldiers in combat. The deaths in battle, however traumatic, came with a framework. There was the language of sacrifice, of falling for one's country, the official narrative that gave meaning, however inadequate, to the loss. There were decorations, sometimes, and official letters, and the eventual construction of memorials and commemorations that placed the dead within a collective story of national experience. For the families of men executed by Schörner's orders, none of this framework applied. Their sons and husbands had been killed not by the enemy, but by the army they were serving. In many cases, the families were told simply that the man had been killed in action, the specific circumstances of his death carefully omitted from official communications. The truth came later, if it came at all. The West German state, in the decades following the war, was slow to address the specific question of soldiers executed by their own commanders. The political and cultural pressures of the post-war period, the need to construct a functioning democratic state, the desire to integrate former Wehrmacht soldiers into the new society without creating permanent classes of the condemned, the genuine complexity of distinguishing between executions that represented genuine military crimes and those that represented judicial murder, made comprehensive reckoning difficult. Veterans organizations, many of which were dominated by former officers who had served in the same system that produced the executions, resisted efforts to single out specific forms of wartime conduct for retrospective condemnation. The result was a long delay in the formal rehabilitation of soldiers executed for desertion or cowardice, a rehabilitation that would not be fully achieved until the early years of the 21st century. In September of 2009, the German Bundestag passed legislation formally rehabilitating the soldiers executed by German military courts during the Second World War. The law annulled the convictions, establishing in law what had been established in moral philosophy decades earlier, that the men who had been killed for cowardice or desertion had not committed crimes in any meaningful sense of the word and should not be remembered as criminals. The legislation was specifically directed at the judicial apparatus of the Third Reich's military courts, the same apparatus through which Schörner's summary executions had been technically, if fraudulently, legitimized. It came 64 years after the end of the war. It came decades after the men who had been executed, and many of the families who had loved them, were gone. It was better than nothing. It was also an illustration of how long the distance between the commission of an injustice and the formal acknowledgement of it can stretch, when the political conditions for acknowledgement are slow to arrive. The specific soldiers executed under Schörner's orders did not become famous. They did not have biographies written about them, did not have their names attached to specific battles or campaigns that historical memory preserved. They were privates and corporals and sergeants, mostly, the ordinary infantry of the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front, men from towns and villages across Germany who had been conscripted into a war they had varying degrees of commitment to, who had survived years of fighting and cold and hunger and fear, and had been killed, in the end, not by Soviet bullets, but by the orders of the man behind them. Their names exist in fragments in the archival record, in the legal proceedings that documented specific cases, in the family histories that individual Germans have assembled by patient research. They do not exist in the collective memory with anything like the prominence their deaths warrant. The contrast with the commemorative traditions that surround other categories of Second World War death is stark. The soldiers who died at Stalingrad have been the subject of extensive scholarship, numerous books, films, memorials. The soldiers who died in the battles for Berlin in the final weeks of the war have their own literature of remembrance. Even the soldiers of Army Group Courland, the men who held the Baltic Pocket through the winter of 1944 to 1945, have received the attention of historians drawn to the particular drama of their situation. The men who died behind the front lines, hanged from trees by the orders of a general, have no equivalent literature. Their deaths were not dramatic in the way that battle deaths are dramatic. They did not occur in the context of operations that military historians trace on maps. They occurred in the margins, in rear areas, at crossroads, in the administrative spaces behind the fighting, and they have tended to remain in those margins in the historical record. The effort to bring them out of those margins is not merely an academic exercise. It is a form of moral accounting that matters because of what it establishes about the nature of the events we are discussing. If Schörner's story is told only as a story of operational command, of defensive battles held, of positions maintained, of an army kept together under extreme pressure, it is a story that can be assessed in the morally neutral language of military analysis. If it is told as a story that includes the men he killed, it becomes what it actually was, a story about the exercise of lethal power over people who had no recourse, no appeal, and no protection from the man who commanded them. The distinction is not rhetorical. It is the difference between history as a record of events and history as a form of justice. What those soldiers would have said had they lived, what they wanted from the war, from their service, from the world that waited for them if they survived, is lost to us now, irrecoverable in the way that all inner lives lost to premature death are irrecoverable. They were young men, mostly. They had come from families that had expected them back. They had plans, or the ordinary human equivalents of plans, the unformed expectations of people who assume they will have a future and have not yet decided precisely what to do with it. The war had taken much of that from them before Schörner's orders finished the work. They deserve to be named in the history of his career, even when specific names are not fully available, acknowledged as the reality behind the abstractions of command decisions, as the human cost of the particular kind of leadership that Ferdinand Schörner chose to exercise. The rehabilitation legislation of 2009 gave them, in law, the exoneration that common sense had always suggested they deserved. It was a formal declaration that the Germany of the Federal Republic stood on the opposite side of the line from the Germany whose courts had killed them. Whether the gap between the law's declaration and the full public memory of what happened to them will ever be fully closed is a question that belongs to the present and the future rather than to the past. History provides the materials for that closure. Whether the closure happens is a choice that the living make about the dead and about what kind of relationship with their own past they are willing to commit to. Chapter 17. The Federal Republic and the Weight of Memory. Germany's Long Reckoning, _. West Germany after 1945 was a nation that faced a challenge without historical precedent: how to build a functioning, decent democratic society out of the ruins of a state that had committed crimes so extreme that the category of war crimes had to be essentially invented to describe them. The challenge was not simply political or legal, though it was both of those things. It was cultural, psychological, and in a deep sense philosophical. It required a society to look at what it had done, to acknowledge it, to integrate the acknowledgement into its collective self-understanding, and to go on living, to not be destroyed by the weight of that acknowledgement, but to be shaped by it in ways that made the recurrence of what had happened genuinely less likely. The process was slow, incomplete, contested, and real. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen without significant resistance. The 1950s were, in many respects, a decade of managed silence on the question of German responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi period. The Adenauer government focused on rebuilding, on integration into the Western Alliance, on the political and economic stabilization that the Federal Republic's survival required, was not inclined to open the full depth of the question in ways that might destabilize the social consensus necessary for the project of reconstruction. Former Nazis occupied positions in the civil service, the judiciary, the business world. Former Wehrmacht officers found their way into the new West German armed forces, the Bundeswehr, established in 1955 as a contribution to NATO's collective defense. The reckoning was deferred. When it came, and it came in waves, each more searching than the last, it was driven not primarily by government initiative, but by the pressure of events, and by the activism of individuals and groups who refused to let the silence hold. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, broadcast internationally and followed with agonized attention by German audiences, made the bureaucratic machinery of the Holocaust visible in ways that no previous proceeding had managed. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, running from 1963 to 1965, brought the industrial scale of the killing operations into German courtrooms and into German public consciousness. Student movements of the late 1960s pressed their parents and teachers and political leaders with questions about what had been known and what had been done and what had been said. Each wave of confrontation pushed the reckoning deeper, made the managed silence harder to maintain, and shaped the cultural and political landscape of the Federal Republic in ways that distinguished it, increasingly, from the society that had preceded it. Schörner's trials, the Soviet conviction of 1952, and the West German prosecution of the late 1950s were small episodes within this larger reckoning, and they occupy a specific place in the German memory of the period. They established that the Wehrmacht had not been, as some post-war narratives sought to claim, a clean institution standing apart from the crimes of the Nazi political leadership, that its commanders had participated in the ideological extremism of the regime, had implemented its most brutal demands, and had themselves committed acts that the post-war legal system recognized as criminal. This was important. It was one piece of a much larger dismantling of what German historians later called the Wehrmacht myth, the claim that the German military had fought an honorable war and that the crimes had been committed by others. The Wehrmacht myth persisted in some quarters for decades after the war, sustained by veterans organizations, by popular histories that focused on operational achievements rather than conduct, and by a cultural tendency to distinguish between ordinary soldiers who had simply fought for their country and the political apparatus that had directed the war toward criminal ends. The myth was not completely false. Within the Wehrmacht, there were genuinely hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had no personal involvement in any war crime, and who experienced the war primarily as the brutal, exhausting, terrifying experience that war always is, but as a general claim about the institution, as an assertion that the Wehrmacht as a whole stood separate from the crimes of the regime. It was false, and the accumulation of documentary and scholarly evidence over the post-war decades demonstrated its falsehood with increasing specificity. Schörner's career was one element in this demonstration. His promotions, his decorations, his personal relationship with Hitler, his implementation of the most extreme disciplinary demands of the late-war Wehrmacht, all of these documented facts were inconsistent with the myth of the clean institution. But there were others: the involvement of Wehrmacht units in the mass killings of the occupied territories, the coordination between the army and the Einsatzgruppen, the Commissar order that had directed the killing of Soviet political officers, the documented participation of army units in anti-partisan operations that targeted civilian populations. The full picture, when it was assembled over the following decades, was one of an institution that had been deeply complicit in the regime's crimes, not uniformly, not at every level, not in every unit, but systematically enough that the claim of institutional innocence could not be sustained. The traveling exhibition that opened in Hamburg in 1995, organized by the Hamburg Institute for Social Research and subsequently shown across Germany and Austria, brought the evidence of Wehrmacht crimes directly into public space, in the form of photographs and documents that made visible what the academic literature had been establishing for decades. The exhibition was controversial, intensely so. It provoked protests, political debates in the Bundestag, challenges to specific items of evidence, and an extraordinary public engagement with questions about the war that the Federal Republic had been working through in more academic settings for years. The controversy itself was productive. It demonstrated that the questions were still alive, that the history had not been settled into comfortable consensus, that the reckoning was still in progress. By the early 21st century, the German engagement with the history of the Second World War had reached a level of depth and seriousness unmatched by any other country in the world in its willingness to examine its own worst chapter. The memorial landscape of Berlin alone, the Holocaust Memorial near the Brandenburg Gate, the topography of terror on the site of the former Gestapo headquarters, the Jewish Museum, the documentation centers and exhibition spaces that had multiplied across the city, told the story of a society that had chosen to keep its worst history visible rather than allow it to recede into comfortable forgetting. Schools taught the history directly and at length. Political culture required that aspirants to public life demonstrate their engagement with the lessons of the period. The phrase, "never again," was not a platitude but a policy commitment, embedded in the Federal Republic's institutional architecture and in the cultural norms of its public life. This is the Germany in which Ferdinand Schörner died in 1973, and it is the Germany in which his historical legacy has been assessed in the decades since. His death passed without official acknowledgement. His grave in Munich does not attract visitors in any number. His name appears in the historical literature, in the scholarly works on the Wehrmacht's command culture, in the legal histories of post-war German prosecutions, in the biographies of Hitler that necessarily include his role as the Führer's favored commander, but it does not appear in the commemorative landscape, in the memorial culture, in the places where German society has chosen to confront its past. He is, in the fullest sense, a figure of the historical record rather than of the living memory. The Germany that outlasted him chose to remember the victims, not the victimizers. That choice is its own form of judgment, and it is one that has proven durable. The lesson of Germany's post-war reckoning, imperfect, contested, ongoing, and genuinely impressive in its depth and sincerity, is that societies can look at their own worst chapters and survive the looking. That the acknowledgement of historical crimes does not destroy the societies that acknowledge them, but, over time, strengthens the moral and institutional foundations on which those societies rest. That the weight of memory, carried honestly and deliberately, is not only bearable, but ultimately necessary for the construction of a future that is genuinely different from the past. Ferdinand Schörner, in death as in life, contributes to this lesson, not through anything admirable in his conduct, but through what the clear historical assessment of his conduct teaches about the conditions that made it possible and the choices that prevent those conditions from recurring. Underscore. Chapter 18. The Final Verdict. What One Life Tells Us About History. Underscore. We have traveled a long way together in this documentary. From the cobblestone streets of Munich in the final years of the 19th century, through the mountain passes of Italy in the First World War, through the political chaos of the Weimar Republic and the accelerating machinery of the Third Reich, through the vast and terrible geography of the Eastern Front, through prison cells in Moscow and Munich, and finally to the quiet, unmarked end of a life that had been anything but quiet. We have followed Ferdinand Schörner across the full length of one of the most extraordinary and most troubling careers in the history of modern warfare. It is time, now, to step back from the particular and consider what the whole of it means. What does one man's life, examined in this detail, actually tell us? The first thing it tells us is something about the nature of ambition when it operates without moral constraint. Schörner was ambitious, not in a hidden or reluctant way, but openly, energetically, with a consistent orientation throughout his career toward the next rank, the next command, the next recognition. There is nothing inherently wrong with military ambition, the desire to rise, to command at greater levels of responsibility, to have one's capabilities recognized and utilized. These are ordinary and in many respects useful qualities in a professional soldier. What made Schörner's ambition destructive was its absolute priority over every other consideration. His career was served before his soldiers, before his country, before any ethical principle that might have complicated the pursuit. When the system that rewarded his ambition demanded things that a man with a functioning moral compass would have refused, Schörner did not refuse. He performed, because performance was what the system required, and performance was what he had trained himself to give. The second thing his life tells us is about the mechanics of totalitarian command, about what happens to the institutions of a modern state when they are systematically oriented toward the expression of a single will rather than the maintenance of any system of accountability. The Wehrmacht of the Second World War was not simply a military organization pursuing military objectives. It was a military organization embedded in a political system that had dismantled the ordinary checks on power, the legal constraints, the institutional independence, the cultural norms, that prevent military authority from becoming something indistinguishable from private terror. Schörner flourished in this system, not despite its removal of constraints, but because of it. The constraints that a functioning military legal system would have imposed on his disciplinary practices, the requirement for proper courts, for defense counsel, for proportionate sentences, for the due process that even military justice requires, were exactly the constraints that the Third Reich's increasingly desperate command culture had stripped away. He operated in the space those removed constraints had created, and he filled that space completely. The third thing his life tells us, and this is perhaps the most important, is about the specific quality of moral courage that extreme systems require and that most individuals, most of the time, find most difficult to exercise. The courage to say, within an institution that demands absolute compliance, that there is something it is asking for that you will not give. The July 20th conspirators had this courage. They paid for it with their lives. Schörner did not have it. He did not appear to be a man who struggled with the question, who faced the demand for compliance, and overcame his better nature in submitting to it. He was, as far as the available evidence can establish, a man who genuinely did not experience the demands placed on him as demands that required moral resistance. He was, in the deepest sense, adapted to the system, not a good man corrupted by extreme circumstances, but a man whose values had been, from very early in his development, oriented so completely toward hierarchy and obedience and the absolute authority of the state that the Third Reich's demands felt, to him, like natural extensions of principles he had always held. This is the most disturbing aspect of his story, because it resists the narrative that places the crimes of the Nazi period at the door of extraordinary evil, of people so different from ordinary human beings that their actions can be explained by invoking a moral category of monsters that stands entirely outside the normal range of human behavior. Schörner was not a monster in this sense. He was a policeman's son from Munich who loved the mountains and believed in Germany and wanted to rise as far as his abilities would carry him. The system in which he operated gave his ordinary qualities extraordinary destructive expression. The values he held, not unusual values in the conservative Bavarian Catholic milieu of his upbringing, not unusual values in the European military culture of his era, were values that, in the specific circumstances of the Third Reich, became killing values. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, writing about Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in the early 1960s, introduced a phrase that has been debated, refined, and contested ever since, but that captures something real about the mechanism we have been examining in Schörner's career: the banality of evil. Arendt was not arguing that the crimes of the Holocaust were banal. She was arguing that the man responsible for organizing the transportation of millions of people to their deaths was not a monster, but a bureaucrat, a career civil servant who had substituted institutional compliance for personal moral judgment, and who, in doing so, had made himself a tool for purposes he had never fully confronted as his own moral responsibility. Schörner was not Eichmann. His crimes were different in character, more personal in their execution, more directly connected to the exercise of individual authority rather than bureaucratic process. But the mechanism Arendt identified, the substitution of institutional loyalty for moral conscience, is visible in his career with a clarity that makes her framework useful even in this different context. The soldiers who were hanged on Schörner's orders in the spring of 1945 were not killed because Schörner was incapable of imagining their humanity. He saw them. He was present at the front, visible to them, more physically proximate to the men he commanded than almost any other senior German officer. He simply decided, in a decision that he apparently experienced as entirely routine, as simply the enforcement of the standards his position required him to enforce, that their lives were less important than the signal their deaths would send to other men who might be considering similar behavior. He made this calculation quickly, without apparent internal struggle, and then moved on to the next decision. The horror of that is not in the absence of imagination, but in the presence of a complete value system that had organized the calculation in advance, that had made the killing the obvious answer before the question was even fully formed. What does the verdict of history look like after more than 8 decades of evidence and argument? It looks like this. Ferdinand Schörner was a capable officer who possessed genuine physical courage and real organizational ability, and who placed both of those qualities entirely in the service of a criminal regime's most extreme demands. He rose to the highest rank his military could offer, not because he was the best soldier his country produced, but because he was the most useful to a leadership that had, in its final phase, decided that usefulness meant compliance, and that compliance meant the willingness to do whatever was asked regardless of the human cost. He killed soldiers who were under his protection. He abandoned the army he had been given command of at the moment of its greatest need. He lived out his old age in the city where he was born, convicted by 2 separate legal systems, unreformed in any publicly visible way, and died in 1973, leaving behind a historical record, that is, by the most careful scholarly assessment available, a record of professional capacity put to criminal use. The Germany that continues beyond his grave has chosen, imperfectly and continually, and with the genuine effort that imperfect choices made in good faith require, to build something different from what he represented. That choice, carried forward in institutions and education and laws and memorials, and the slow, difficult work of collective moral reckoning, is the answer that history returns to Schörner's career. Not a punishment, exactly, not a refutation, something more profound and more durable than either, a demonstration that what he stood for was not inevitable, not the only possible expression of German values and German character, not the necessary endpoint of the military and cultural tradition from which he emerged. He was one outcome. The Federal Republic, the unified Germany, the country that chose the Holocaust Memorial over the War Memorial and the Nuremberg Principles over the Führerprinzip. That Germany is another outcome. The same soil, the same history, a different choice. The mountains of Bavaria, where he first learned to climb, are still there. The paths through the Italian Alps where he won his Blue Max are still walkable. The plains of the Eastern Front where he built his terrible reputation have been absorbed into the landscapes of modern states, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic countries. that are now building their own futures on the ground where the war's worst chapters were written. The world that made Ferdinand Schörner is gone. The questions his life raises are not. They are present wherever authority is exercised without accountability, wherever institutional loyalty is placed above personal moral responsibility, wherever the machinery of command is used against the very people it is supposed to protect. They are present, in other words, everywhere that human beings organize themselves under power, which is to say, everywhere, always, without exception. That is why a story this old is worth telling tonight, in the quiet hours, as the world outside settles into sleep. Not to disturb sleep with horror, but to offer what all genuine history offers when it is told honestly, the knowledge that the choices that made the past were actually choices, made by people, not by forces, and that the choices that will make the future are also choices, waiting to be made, by people who have the extraordinary advantage of knowing what came before. This has been the complete history of Ferdinand Schörner. Thank you for staying with this story to the end.